Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into something more historical, and honestly, more complicated than you might expect. We're diving deep into the world of feudal Japan, where love, lust, politics, poetry, and power mixed like incense smoke in a lacquered bedroom. This isn't your sanitized textbook stuff, it's messy, it's tender, it's occasionally very weird, and, spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this if you've got a thin skin about, well, just about anything. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Quick poll in the comments. What time is it where you are, and what city are you listening from? I want to know who's up with me tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes to the gentle sway of a silk screen painted with cranes, mist, and chrysanthemums. You're in Kyoto, somewhere in the late Heian period, around the year 1000, and already your senses are under assault. The scent of agar wood curls around you, sweet and smoky. You're kneeling in a room that's all golden light and shadow, where polished floors reflect the flicker of oil lamps. Outside, cherry blossoms drift silently past like lazy snow, and inside, you're about to attend a rendezvous, though romance might be pushing it. Here in the imperial court, love doesn't happen over candlelit dinners or hand-holding strolls. It happens with a poem. And if your poem is good enough, mysterious, melancholy, maybe hinting at dreams or dew-drenched sleeves, then someone might answer. With another poem, naturally. That's foreplay here. You don't just say, "I want you." You say something like, "Even the moonlight fails to match the glimmer of your departing footsteps." Which, okay, is much classier than a DM at 2 AM. But it takes some work. You're trailing a nobleman tonight, anonymous, perfumed, wearing so many robes it's unclear where he begins and fabric ends. He's off to visit a lady of the court under the cover of darkness. That's how these affairs go. No knocking, no chit-chat. Just a secret visit to a woman's room, hoping she hasn't barred the door. And yes, this is expected. If you're a refined nobleman, you sneak around and write poems to multiple women. And if you're a noblewoman, you read them, and then decide if the man gets in. It's a world where women have considerable power over who gets access, but once they allow it, things become complicated. Love and sex are deeply interwoven with status, family politics, and long-term advantage. There's no Tinder, but there is reputation. Historical fact. In the Heian court, marriages weren't binding in the way we think. A woman could have multiple lovers, as long as it didn't bring shame. Her status was tied to her natal family, not necessarily her husband. And children, they, often stayed with the mother's side. The nobleman you're shadowing finally slips into her room, which is divided by several curtains, layers within layers. You can't see much, just the faint outline of two people whispering in the half-dark. What follows is less about lust and more about atmosphere. Long sleeves brushing, an artful lowering of the eyes, an exchange of incense scents. Bodies remain swaddled in layers of kimono, and yet somehow it's profoundly intimate. They might not even have sex tonight, and if they do, it's likely awkward. Not because they're prudes, but because the Heian elite were obsessed with appearances. Even in bed, you had to preserve an image of grace. Loud noises, embarrassing. Getting undressed too quickly, vulgar. Morning after etiquette, absolutely mandatory. Quirky fact. Lovers were expected to send a morning after poem the next day. If a man ghosted you in 11th century Kyoto, it wasn't just rude, it was a social disaster. And if he wrote a bad poem, honestly, that was worse. There's a soft rustle now, someone's moving behind the screen, and just like that, the visit is over. He's gone before dawn, off to write his verse. You can almost hear him composing it silently, eyes half closed, as he walks past the first light of day spilling over the Kamo River. Back in her chambers, the woman adjusts her robes and begins her own poem in reply. She's not a passive recipient of courtship. She's a poet herself, often sharper and more skilled than the men who pursue her. Her reputation, ironically, depends not on her chastity, but on her cleverness. There's an open debate among scholars about just how much sexual freedom women in this period truly had. Some argue that the elite women of the Heian court wielded significant autonomy through language, poetry, and social networks. Others suggest that, despite appearances, they were ultimately hemmed in by gender expectations and lineage duties. The answer likely floats somewhere in the folds of those 20-layered robes. Hard to grasp, deliberately obscured, like everything else in this world. You leave the palace just as the sun climbs past the mountains. People on the streets are already beginning to stir, but that moonlit world of incense and whispered verses still clings to you like the scent of burning aloes wood. It was beautiful, yes, but deeply performative. Like sex staged as Kabuki, complete with masks, and yet you kind of get it. In a society where words are everything and actions are subtle, sex isn't always physical. Sometimes it's a perfectly chosen syllable, a glance that lingers a fraction too long, or a poem, folded and perfumed, slipped under a screen in the middle of the night. By the time you've drifted into the next chapter of this world, you're starting to realise that feudal Japan isn't one era. It's a centuries-long mood board. You're still in Kyoto, but we've fast-forwarded a few generations. The Heian period has given way to even more stratified courtly life, and now the sexual landscape, while still perfumed and poetic, gets a little more practical, and a lot more transactional. Tonight you're invited, well, not invited, more like secretly observing, a high-status affair in full bloom. This time it's not about stolen glances and poetry under the moonlight. It's about aphrodisiacs, subtle rivalry, and legacy building. And it starts, of all things, with a dinner. You sit on the edge of a tatami mat in the middle of a grand residence filled with lacquered wood, paper lanterns, and the occasional polite chuckle echoing down a hall. The lady of the house wears layers of silk dyed in the colours of early autumn, plum and gold and russet, while her husband reclines with the easy arrogance of a man who knows he owns land, retainers, and several concubines. You'd think this would cause tension, but here's the thing, concubines are part of the deal. In noble society, one wife isn't enough to secure political connections or heirs, you need options. The main wife, however, holds her ground like a seasoned general. She isn't just the wife, she's the wife. And her role tonight? Host a banquet with aphrodisiac laced delicacies in hopes of winning her husband's attention back, if only for the evening. A bit of dried abalone, some ginseng, and a dish that smells suspiciously of grated yam, all whispered to increase vitality and desire. Sex in this context isn't just about passion, it's a strategic performance, laced with ingredients both literal and emotional. Historical fact: in many feudal households, aristocratic men had multiple women under their roof, wives, concubines, mistresses, sometimes even their lovers' handmaidens. But only the principal wife had the honour of managing the household, preserving bloodlines and, if she was shrewd, controlling the flow of affection. You move closer, invisible but watching, as the couple shares a bowl of sake. She leans in slightly, brushing a fingertip along the rim of the cup, her voice barely above a whisper. It's a subtle move, but in this world, subtle is the whole game. A well-timed sip, a gentle laugh at the right moment, it's all part of an unspoken ritual. If she plays her cards right, maybe he'll spend the night in her quarters instead of visiting the younger concubine who waits 2 rooms down. But you sense something else in the air, competition. Because while he smiles at his wife, his eyes flicker toward the sliding screen where a second woman lingers just out of sight. She's younger, maybe less refined, but her presence is obvious. And in this house, that's not a scandal, it's practically expected. The conversation drifts to poetry again because, yes, that still matters, but now there's a sharper undertone. The women of this house engage in what could only be called poetic dueling. One poem mentions fading chrysanthemums. The next counters with something about second blossoms in winter. It's sensual, but also strategic. Every word is a flex, every verse a chess move. Quirky fact: some noble families kept journals recording who slept with whom and on what day, to track fertility windows, astrological alignments, and even omens. Think of it like a handwritten version of a dating app mixed with a horoscope, curated by your grandmother and a Shinto priest. Eventually the party winds down. The husband, clearly pleased but clearly drunk, rises and meanders toward the back wing of the house. You follow, padding silently across the warm wooden floor. He passes one room, then another. Finally, he stops. Not at the wife's chambers, nor the young concubines, but somewhere in between. The woman who greets him at the door is neither highest nor newest. She's middle-ranking, steady, predictable. You realise sometimes consistency beats cunning. What happens inside is slow, practiced, and surprisingly tender. There's very little drama here, just two people folding into each other out of routine rather than desperation. Feudal Japan wasn't all passion plays and midnight poetry. It was also years of quiet encounters in the same room with the same partner, where comfort was more erotic than novelty. As you retreat, drifting back through the hallways where incense lingers in the rafters, you can't help but notice how much of sex here is governed by timing. Not just emotional timing, but literal time. Birth seasons, lunar cycles, family politics. One wrong tryst, and you could be demoted or cast out. One right affair, and your lineage might ascend for generations. There's ongoing debate among scholars about how much sexual agency women in polygynous households really had. Some argue women like the main wife held tremendous sway through charm, influence, and long-term manoeuvring. Others point out the deep anxiety and competition baked into the system, where a woman's value could hinge on the birth of a male child or a husband's fleeting favour. The truth? It depends on the house, the people. The power plays happening behind every scroll door. Outside, the sky begins to lighten. A servant quietly sprinkles water on the stones by the garden to keep the dust down before morning. You pass her silently. She doesn't look up. She knows what kind of night it's been. In this house, and in others like it, pleasure is political, and desire wears 1,000 masks, some silk, some steel. You wake up, or maybe just phase into the next dream, and you're somewhere that smells faintly of cedar, calligraphy ink and powdered incense. You're still in Kyoto, but now you're sitting cross-legged in a private chamber that looks more like a studio than a bedroom. The air is quiet, padded by thick shoji screens and silk hangings. On the table in front of you is an object that might change your life, or at least your idea of what literature can be, the tale of Genji. Written in the early 11th century by a noblewoman named Murasaki Shikibu, this sprawling work is often credited as the world's first novel. And wow, is it horny? But not in the way you might think. It's not about explicit detail, it's about longing, power, missed signals, and those weird moments when seduction starts to feel like a political negotiation. It's also long, like really long. 54 chapters of mood, moonlight, heartbreak, and bedroom etiquette. You lean in as a court reader recites a section aloud, voice low and musical, and you realise this isn't just a story. It's a user manual for the romantic elite. In it, Prince Genji, the ultimate soft-boy aristocrat with just enough scandal in his bloodline to be hot, wanders through court life wooing basically every woman who crosses his path. He's charming, poetic, and emotionally complex, but he's also kind of a disaster. He falls in love with his stepmother. He raises a girl to become his ideal woman. He has affairs that end in shame, exile, and actual ghosts. And somehow, women still swoon over him. It's beautiful. It's tragic. It's also kind of uncomfortable. Historical fact, the tale of Genji wasn't written in Chinese, the official language of government and high literature, but in Japanese kana script, which was associated with women. This wasn't just stylistic, it was political. Murasaki was staking out a feminine intellectual space in a male-dominated culture, and she did it by writing a deeply emotional, erotically charged epic that became the blueprint for courtly romance. You flip to a chapter where Genji seduces a lady by waiting until she falls asleep, then slipping under the covers and hoping she doesn't freak out. Consent, clearly, was understood differently here. There's no screaming, no chase scene, just layers of plausible deniability. If she protests lightly, he takes it as flirtation. If she doesn't protest at all, that's permission. This is where things get murky. The Heian court didn't separate love, sex, and politics. They stacked them like lacquer boxes, each hiding something a little darker inside. Even so, the female characters in Genji aren't passive dolls. They write poems. They ghost him. They suffer, yes, but they also manipulate, escape, and sometimes flat out win. One woman even fakes illness to avoid seeing him. You start to see the whole thing as a kind of courtly fantasy. Part erotic dream, part cautionary tale, part messy, serialized soap opera with incense. Quirky fact, Heian aristocrats didn't believe in expressing emotion directly. Crying too openly was seen as vulgar, but so was being too stoic. You had to leak just the right number of tears, ideally while reading or writing poetry about the moon. So when Genji characters sob delicately in their sleeves, they're not weak. They're peak fashionable. You close the scroll, hands still tingling with the implications. This wasn't just bedtime reading, it was aspirational, court. Women didn't just consume this literature, they emulated it. Some kept their own diaries filled with romantic episodes, both real and imagined, mirroring Murasaki's poetic style. You can almost hear them whispering behind folding fans, rating Genji's lovers like a feudal bachelor season. But here's the twist. Genji dies, and the book goes on. It follows his descendants, who spiral into increasingly strange, sad love affairs of their own. And the tone changes. What starts out lush and romantic becomes somber and existential. The final chapters, known as the Uji chapters, are haunted by loss, dreams, and spiritual longing. It's like even Murasaki realized. Eventually, beauty fades, desire disappoints, and sex can't save you. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how autobiographical the book is. Was Murasaki reflecting her own disillusionment with court life? Was Genji her fantasy or her warning? Some believe the novel critiques the very system it seems to glamorize, a soft rebellion in elegant verse. Others think she was simply documenting the world she knew, in all its gorgeous dysfunction. Whatever the case, she managed to carve her voice into a world that tried to keep women ornamental. You step outside into a garden framed by cherry blossoms and stone lanterns. There's a soft wind, and it carries the faint smell of incense and old paper. The world of Genji feels distant now, but it clings to the air like perfume. A slow burn, a melancholy echo, and honestly, kind of a vibe. Somewhere nearby, a court lady reclines behind a silk screen, brushing ink onto her own page. Maybe she's writing a love story. Maybe she's cataloguing her dreams, or maybe she's plotting how to politely destroy her romantic rival with a really pointed metaphor about plum blossoms. Either way, she owes something to Murasaki. And now, so do you. You're not even fully through shaking off the dreamscape of Genji's poetic bed-hopping before the air thickens with incense and expectation again. But this time, it's less dreamy and more administrative. The romantic whispers and veiled glances of the high-end elite are giving way to something colder, heavier. Now you find yourself in a large wooden compound tucked into the outskirts of the capital, with an intimidating entry gate, and at least 3 women watching you from behind sliding doors. Welcome to the world of feudal marriage. It's not about love, it's about land, alliances, children, and above all, appearances. Marriage among the upper classes in feudal Japan, especially during the Kamakura and Muromachi periods, was less a personal decision and more of a dynasty strategy meeting with side benefits. You're now watching a wedding procession approach. A groom from a samurai family decked out in formal hakama with swords tucked ceremoniously at his side, and a bride dressed in layered robes so heavy she can barely move without 2 attendants. They don't look at each other. That's not the point. Marriage here often begins not with affection but negotiation. Fathers speak for daughters. Go-betweens deliver offers and counter-offers. What's your rice yield? How many soldiers can your family muster? Does your temple affiliation line up with ours? The bride may never have met her future husband until this very moment, and she may never truly live with him either. In many cases, she'll stay with her natal family and he'll visit occasionally, especially if her family holds more prestige or power. Historical fact. During many eras of feudal Japan, especially in aristocratic and samurai circles, yakusora local marriage was common. That means the husband visited the wife's home, sometimes just at night. These arrangements kept women closer to their families and reinforced matrilineal ties, a surprising flip in a society often presumed to be rigidly patriarchal. You follow the couple into the ceremonial room, where offerings are made to the household gods, and sake is exchanged in 3 formal sips, 1 cup each, 3 times over. This is the Sansankudo ritual, symbolizing a bond not just between 2 people, but 2 families. There's no kiss, no dramatic "I do." There's quiet solemnity and the subtle grinding of duty over desire. You start to realize that love, if it arrives, will have to sneak in the back door much later. The newlyweds retreat into a side room that feels more like a negotiation chamber than a honeymoon suite. 2 futons are laid side by side. The attendants retreat, and for the first time, husband and wife are alone. You watch their body language, hesitant, unfamiliar. This isn't romantic tension, it's practical awkwardness. They are expected to consummate the union tonight, and there's very little instruction beyond that. She lies rigid on the mat. He fumbles with the layers of fabric. This isn't anyone's fantasy. And yet, sex within marriage wasn't necessarily the peak of erotic life. In many noble households, it was more of a box to check, especially if heirs were the goal. The real passion, the real emotional stakes, those happened elsewhere, with concubines, with lovers, sometimes even with the servants. In fact, concubinage wasn't just tolerated, it was encouraged, especially if a wife failed to produce sons. Having multiple sexual partners wasn't scandalous, it was strategic. Quirky fact, samurai households sometimes documented sexual arrangements in writing, down to rotating sleeping schedules among multiple wives and concubines. In extreme cases, household members could be punished for unsanctioned intimacy, including unscheduled bed visits. Yes, even sex had a ledger. Over time, the bride may gain status if she bears children, especially boys, but she may also be quietly sidelined if she fails to do so, or if a more politically advantageous woman joins the household. You find her later in a garden staring into a koi pond. Her expression is unreadable. Did she grow to love her husband? Did he ever love her? You'll never know. That wasn't the point of their union. But she has learned how to play her role: hostess, mother, administrator, silent strategist. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how much personal agency women had in these arrangements. Some argue that they were pawns, traded and positioned like chess pieces in a patriarchal game. Others suggest they exercise subtle but powerful control through their natal networks, their children, and their influence over household dynamics. Maybe it was both. Maybe it depended on how sharp you were, and how willing you were to smile while plotting from behind a folding screen. You drift back through the halls, past other rooms with other women. A younger concubine nervously adjusts her hairpin. A maid glances furtively at the passing figure of a junior retainer. Desire simmers everywhere, but it rarely surfaces without consequence. In this house, sex is currency, power is the prize, and love is an unaffordable luxury, unless you're clever enough to hide it in plain sight. You're no longer in the refined elegance of courtly poetry or arranged household ceremonies. Things are sharper now, quieter, heavier. You've stepped into the world of the samurai, and the scent in the air isn't incense or plum blossoms. It's steel, oil, sweat. You're inside the fortified compound of a mid-ranking samurai lord, and tonight you're about to see what happens when loyalty, masculinity and intimacy tangle behind the sliding doors. By day, this man is a servant of the shogun. His life is dictated by duty, swordsmanship, bushido, clan loyalty, the occasional head chopping when diplomacy fails. He bows when told. He kneels without complaint. But here, inside his private residence, the masks begin to crack. You watch him enter, stripping away layers of armour and formality. His retainer silently pours sake. No one speaks. There's a rhythm to this silence, a practiced ritual of letting the pressure bleed out before the world rushes back in. Samurai culture, famously stoic and rigid, had surprisingly layered expectations when it came to sex and relationships. Within the home, marriage was expected, of course. He has a wife, perhaps even a concubine, and they serve their prescribed roles, producing heirs, maintaining the household, managing appearances. But emotional intimacy, that's something different. That's risky. So when the samurai glances at his page, a boy barely 18, dressed plainly, kneeling slightly behind him, there's a pause in the room. Not hesitation, permission. Historical fact. Many samurai practiced wakashudo, or the way of youths, a tradition of male-male mentorship that often included emotional and physical intimacy. These relationships weren't considered taboo or immoral at the time. In fact, they were idealized, romanticized, and even praised in warrior literature. The older, samurai served as a mentor, protector, and sometimes lover. The younger man offered devotion, beauty, and the promise of future strength. You follow them into a small side chamber. Nothing lavish, just tatami mats and a low lantern. There's no seduction, no poetry. The relationship is built on loyalty and discipline, not flowery flirtation. The samurai offers the boy a cup of sake, which he accepts with both hands, head bowed. Then they sit, close, closer, hands touch, deliberate. No rush, no ceremony. Outside this room, the world would call it mentorship, brotherhood, a spiritual bond between warriors. Inside the room, it's physical, quiet, stripped of pretense but no less intense. There's tenderness in the way the older man touches the boy's shoulder, but also expectation. This is not an equal exchange. One holds power, the other offers access. Quirky fact: some samurai wrote love letters to their male companions that would put most modern romance novels to shame, pages filled with metaphors of blades and wind, of unspoken longing and oaths stronger than marriage. These weren't secrets, they were status symbols. You watch the boy lie down, face calm, body still. The samurai undresses carefully, always with the awareness of his sword beside him. Even in moments like this, the warrior code is never fully dropped. His movements are deliberate, more like Carter than foreplay. And yet, there's a strange beauty to it. Not passion exactly, not lust, something steadier. A sense that control, even in intimacy, is the most sacred act of all. But this tradition doesn't exist without its contradictions. As you drift backward into the night, you hear hushed voices, gossip from the kitchen maids, a whispered remark from a visiting monk. Not everyone sees wakashudo as noble. Some claim it's exploitation dressed up as honour. Others say it's the purest form of love, unmarred by the transactional nature of marriage. Even scholars today argue over the truth. Was it truly consensual, mutually respectful, or just another structure of power cloaked in ritual? The samurai wakes before dawn, no cuddling, no small talk. He dresses in silence, the sword sliding back into place at his hip. The boy, still half asleep, bows low as he exits. No goodbyes, no promises. This isn't a romance novel. It's a memory, a lesson, an oath written into the body. Later in the courtyard, the samurai meets his wife. She offers him tea, he nods. They speak briefly, about the garden, the schedule, the son studying calligraphy. She knows about the boy, of course, but she says nothing. That's not her role. What matters is the family name, the inheritance, the structure that holds everything in place. Desire exists, but it bends to duty. Always. You walk through the compound gates, leaving behind the stone lanterns and rigid calm. The world of the samurai is a paradox. Rigid but fluid, loyal but layered, controlled yet deeply intimate. Sex here isn't romantic or rebellious. It's part of the code. Just another sword hidden beneath the folds of a carefully tied obi. You don't go far, just a few days down the path, maybe 100 candle lengths away from the stone halls of the samurai, and the world tilts again. This time, it's a garden that greets you. Not the manicured stillness of a noble estate, but a lush, overgrown one behind temple walls. The air smells of moss, sandalwood, and something faintly damp. You're in a Buddhist monastery during the Kamakura period, and tonight you're going to find out what happens when celibacy and human craving try, and fail, to ignore each other. The monks here are supposed to have left desire behind. That's part of the deal. No attachments, no indulgences, and certainly no sex. But you notice early on that reality is, as usual, a little less tidy than the rules. In the meditation hall, rows of shaved heads bow in unison, chanting with rhythmic breath. But there's a tension in the air that doesn't come from bad posture. You sit in the back as a young monk, barely 20, glances up just once. It's subtle, but not invisible. He looks across the room at another monk, older, stoic, probably the one who gave him his first robes, and it clicks. Desire in these walls doesn't vanish, it morphs. It's carefully redirected through chants, rituals, and discipline. But even monks are human. Even monks remember the warmth of skin or the taste of breath in winter. The young monk catches himself, drops his gaze, and returns to his breathing. But the heat in his face says what he won't. Historical fact. Though Buddhist doctrine strictly prohibited sexual activity for ordained monks, actual practice varied widely. Some sects allowed married clergy, others turned a blind eye to discreet relationships. Records show that many monasteries, especially in remote areas, developed unofficial pair bonds between monks, quietly tolerated as long as they didn't disrupt discipline or scandalise donors. After the service ends, you follow the younger monk into the garden. He walks alone, pretending to admire the early blooms of plum trees. But when he circles back, the older monk is waiting by the gate. They don't speak. They simply walk together, slowly, into the monk's quarters. You hesitate at the doorway, half expecting robes to flutter off and forbidden passion to erupt like a Kabuki play. But no, it's quieter than that. The room they enter isn't even private, just a curtained alcove with 2 futons set apart by a small shelf of prayer beads and incense. They sit cross-legged, knees almost touching, and share a bowl of hot tea. There's no rush, no fumbling, just stillness. And beneath that stillness the thrum of something warmer. The older monk speaks first, a single line. The younger one bows his head. When their hands touch, it's like a whisper rather than a grab. Carefully folded need. Sex in a monastery, if it happens, isn't about rebellion or romance. It's about proximity. Intimacy blooms not in spite of the vows, but because of them. You eat together, sleep near each other, meditate side by side for hours. If desire is a fire, this place is a dry forest. Quirky fact. Some temple diaries from the medieval period record disciplinary action not for sex itself, but for noise during sex. Monks caught in the act might be punished if they disturbed others, but if they were discreet, the offence was often ignored or euphemised. The rule wasn't always don't. It was more like, don't let's catch you, and definitely don't make it weird. Back in the room, nothing too dramatic unfolds. Their gestures are more about trust than heat. Clothes stay mostly on. The bodies here are exhausted, trimmed by austerity. But there's something tender in the way they lean toward each other when the lantern dims. Not quite lovers, not quite anything you can label. This isn't unique, you realise. In many Buddhist communities, across Japan and beyond, the lines between friendship, mentorship and intimacy blur under the weight of shared silence. Scholars still debate how widespread these relationships were, or whether they should even be called sexual in modern terms. Some insist the emotional bonds were chaste, sacred, non-carnal. Others argue the opposite, that monasteries served as quiet enclaves of homoerotic culture, operating under a rule of as long as it doesn't show. The truth probably bends and flexes like a reed in temple wind. You leave the monastery by moonlight, feet soft on the mossy path, the stone lanterns glowing like memory. Behind you, the chants begin again, faint, melodic, and perfectly structured. Desire has no place in this world officially, but it finds a place anyway, in glances, in silence, in the way 2 people learn each other's rhythm, breath, and pauses. You pass through the wooden gate, looking once over your shoulder. The temple stands still. Nothing moves, nothing shows. But you know. You've seen it now. Even here, where desire is supposed to die, it only learns how to kneel. The world around you flickers again, and the perfume of incense and stillness vanishes like a candle snuffed in the wind. Now you're outside. Truly outside. The air is full of earth and smoke, warm hay and something unmistakably human. You're standing on the edge of a rice paddy in late spring, your bare feet sinking slightly into the damp soil. This is peasant country. No temples, no palaces, no sliding doors, just fields, wooden huts, and the quiet, constant hum of survival. And if you're expecting romance or eloquence here, yeah, you'll need to lower that fan. In the world of commoners, farmers, labourers, tradespeople, sex is not wrapped in scrolls or buried under poetic metaphors. It's work. It's biology. It's what happens after a long day of bending over in the fields, washing vegetables in a cold stream, or grinding millet, by hand. But that doesn't make it joyless. If anything, it's more immediate, more instinctive, less layered in performance and more rooted in necessity. You duck inside a thatched roof hut where a young couple is eating a modest supper, rice with pickled daikon, and maybe, if today was lucky, a scrap of fish. They sit close, their knees touching. No formal courtship here. Most likely their union was arranged by the village elders, or decided quietly between families over sake. Maybe it wasn't love, but over time, shared struggle can bloom into something gentler than romance. Intimacy forged by tending the same fields, raising the same pigs, watching the same skies for rain that never comes. Historical fact. During feudal Japan's Edo period, marriages among peasants were often handled at the community level. A local headman or village elders would oversee who married whom, considering labour needs, land distribution, and family alliances. Romantic choice played a role, but practicality ruled. That night, after the lantern has been blown out, you sit quietly in the corner as the couple pulls their futon close to the fire pit. The children sleep in the next room, or more accurately a partitioned-off corner of the same one-room house. Privacy is minimal, but desire finds its place, nestled in hushed laughter, in the way his hand slides over hers, in the quiet exhale she gives when the blankets shift. There's no aphrodisiac, no music, just skin, breath, familiarity. The woman, barely in her 20s, winces slightly as he climbs onto the futon beside her. She's tired, he's exhausted. But they're here, together. You realise something obvious. In this world, sex isn't an act of leisure. It's woven into the rhythm of life. There's no shame, but also no fanfare. No time for coyness when you were up at dawn to feed chickens. Quirky fact. Rural Japan had fertility festivals that involved, among other things, enormous wooden phalluses paraded through the streets, offerings of sack and rice cakes, and prayers for successful childbirth. These weren't underground cult rituals. They were widely accepted, often government-approved events that blurred the line between sacred and seriously NSFW. The next morning, you watch the couple wake at sunrise. She ties back her hair and starts stoking the fire. He puts on his straw sandals and grabs his hoe. No pillow talk, no poems. But when their eyes meet briefly across the room, something passes between them. You'd call it affection, but it's denser than that. Like a thick broth made from leftover bones and salt. Not pretty, but nourishing. Real. You spend the day in the village, observing how relationships play out without the veils of nobility or priesthood. You see lovers stealing moments in the woods, barely hidden behind trees, teenage couples whispering to each other in the shade of the well, an older widow flirting, shamelessly, with a travelling peddler. Sex here isn't precious. It's part of life's cycle, as natural as planting seeds or slaughtering pigs. And when it's done right, it's not just pleasurable, it's affirming. But not all is idyllic. You hear murmurs about unwanted pregnancies, jealousy, and men who drink too much and take what they want. For all its natural rhythms, the village still enforces a brutal patriarchy. A woman without a husband can be vulnerable. A man who steps out on his wife may suffer gossip but rarely consequence. Some couples find happiness, some tolerate each other, and others just endure, because enduring is what the poor do best. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how much autonomy rural women actually had over their sex lives. Some anthropologists argue that peasant women held more social power than their noble counterparts, running households, managing finances, and even initiating divorce. Others point out that economic dependence and social surveillance limited real freedom. The truth, as always, is muddy. Like the fields they work, it depends on the season, the village, the family. As evening falls again, you sit under a persimmon tree and listen to the village wind down. Children laugh, a drunk neighbour sings off-key, and from somewhere nearby the unmistakable rhythm of a creaking futon frame. No incense, no love spells, just two people, maybe in love, maybe not, making space for each other in a world that rarely gives them room to breathe. And honestly, it feels more human than anything you've seen so far. You follow the wind as it changes direction, pulling you out of the muddy simplicity of rural life and into something altogether more hypnotic. Night is falling, and now everything glows. Lanterns sway above narrow canals. Paper umbrellas bob through the mist. You're entering the floating world, the ukiyo, a place suspended between reality and dream, where pleasure isn't just offered, it's orchestrated. And at the centre of it all are the courtesans, dazzling, sharp-witted, and utterly untouchable unless you're rich, poetic, and persistent. This isn't just sex. This is performance art, social manoeuvring, and emotional warfare in a brocade kimono. You're in Yoshiwara, the most famous pleasure district in Edo, modern-day Tokyo. Behind its walled boundaries, the usual rules don't apply, or at least not the ones you're used to. The streets are clean, the buildings elegant, and the women more like celebrities than anything else. Their hairstyles are architectural. Their kimonos are worth more than a farmer's lifetime income. And yet, they live on a tight leash. trapped in a system that idolizes and owns them all at once. You walk into a tea house where a courtesan named Hanai is holding court. She's surrounded by potential clients, most of whom are sweating under the pressure to impress her. Not with cash alone, that's required, sure, but with banter, poetry, taste. You watch as one man quotes a line from a Kabuki play. She replies, with a pun so clever it makes the other guests groan and applaud. She isn't smiling for him, she's controlling the room. Historical fact. Courtesans, particularly the highest-ranked oiran, were more than sex workers. They were entertainers, musicians, calligraphers, and fashion icons. Men came not just to sleep with them, but to be seen with them. Courtesans set trends and wielded influence, within the district's walls anyway. You're allowed to trail Hanai as she prepares for her evening appointment. The ritual is exhausting. Layers of makeup, hairpins like weapons, obi sashes so elaborate she can barely breathe. She doesn't speak while being dressed. The courtesan's silence is part of her allure. By the time she enters her client's room, she's transformed into a fantasy. Cool, distant, perfect. The man inside, older and clearly nervous, bows awkwardly. She bows back, but only slightly. You feel it immediately. This isn't submission, this is theatre. He tries to make conversation. She listens. When he overreaches, touches her sleeve before it's time, she gently pulls away, offering him a sake with a half-lidded glance. She knows exactly when to make him feel desired and when to put him back in his place. The dance continues. Later, when they do sleep together, and yes, eventually they do, it's clinical. Not cold, but controlled. Courtesans were trained from a young age not just in technique but in emotional management. A good courtesan makes you feel loved while giving you absolutely nothing real. You see Hanai lie beside the man, her eyes open, her breath steady. When he falls asleep snoring softly, she reaches over and adjusts his blanket like she's tucking in a child. There's a tenderness in it, but it's practiced, reflexive. The performance never ends. Quirky fact, some courtesans could read and write Chinese classics, a skill most Edo period men outside the elite couldn't even fake. If you couldn't hold a witty conversation or pen a decent haiku, forget it. Access denied. The next morning the man leaves through the front gate with a swagger he definitely didn't have going in. Hanai watches him go from behind a screen, then sighs. She hasn't chosen her clients in years. Her contracts, her schedule, even her bathwater temperature are managed by the brothel's madam. She's a star in a cage, and the cage is lined with silk. There's an open, scholarly debate about whether courtesans had any real autonomy. Some argue that top-tier oiran held power over their clientele, using wit and beauty to climb socially and even, in rare cases, buy their freedom. Others point out the rigid hierarchy and debt bondage that trapped most women in the system from childhood. The truth may be that even the most powerful courtesan was still playing a role written for her by someone else. You walk through the district again as evening falls. The streets are alive with colour, laughter, and the scent of grilled eel. You pass by lesser-known brothels where lower-ranked women sit behind lattice screens, trying to look alluring through exhaustion. They don't get witty banter or poetic flirtation, just drunk men, tight schedules, and no exit. Back at Hanai's tea house, she's being undressed by attendants who know not to speak. Her face is pale with rice powder, her lips still painted like a Kabuki doll. She catches your eye for just a second, and something flickers there. Not sadness exactly, not regret, just weariness. Being a fantasy is a full-time job. You step outside Yoshiwara's gates and breathe in the night. The city beyond is quieter, duller, and far more free. Inside, the floating world shimmers on, beautiful and bright and more than a little haunted. It's built on desire, yes, but not just for bodies, for elegance, for perfection, for something that looks like love but never asks you to stay. You don't leave the pleasure district just yet. Not quite. There's still something else you need to see. Something misunderstood, misrepresented, and frankly, exploited by modern fantasy. The floating world wasn't just home to courtesans. There's another kind of woman who lived and worked here, and the moment you hear the soft twang of a shamisen drifting down the alleyway, you know you're about to meet her. You follow the sound through a narrow corridor of paper lanterns and wooden facades until you arrive at a house that doesn't scream seduction. It hums with restraint. This is a geisha house, and tonight you're going to sit with the women who built a life around the art of almost. A lot of people think they know what geisha are. You probably did too. Tragic figures, high-end sex workers, complicated concubines. But the truth is much more specific and much more fascinating. A geisha isn't defined by who she sleeps with. In fact, that's the least important thing about her. Her job is to entertain, to create a refined atmosphere, to make awkward men feel like they're living inside a woodblock print. Charming, clever, elegant, and thoroughly out of reach. Geisha aren't for touching, they're for watching, listening, drinking with. If you're lucky, they'll laugh at your jokes. You're seated in a tea room with polished floors and a scroll painting of cranes hanging beside a small ikebana arrangement. Two geisha enter, their movements fluid and measured, their voices delicate but never meek. One pours your sake without spilling a drop. The other plucks a shamisen and begins to sing, soft, melancholy, with just enough sadness to make you nostalgic for a life you never lived. Historical fact. Geisha culture emerged in the 18th century, distinct from courtesan life. In fact, the earliest geisha were male, and the first female geisha were actually banned from engaging in sexual activity while working, to keep them separate from the world of prostitution. They trained in music, dance, conversation, and etiquette, skills considered, vital for hosting upper-class clients. Your host tonight is named Chiyo, and she's been a geisha for over a decade. You watch her work the room like a seasoned diplomat. Every word she says is laced with warmth and wit, but she never reveals too much. When a client jokes about marriage, she smiles and replies with a haiku so precise it lands like a slap. She pours drinks, adjusts a falling hairpin, laughs with a sound just loud enough to be real, but not so loud it draws too much attention. She's not just entertaining, she's conducting. You follow her later into the preparation room where makeup is removed and heavy wigs are exchanged for silk head wraps. She's younger than you thought, maybe 28, but her eyes carry decades. You ask her silently why she does this. She shrugs. There are worse ways to make a living. There are worse kinds of performance. And besides, where else can a woman talk and be listened to like this? Outside, she'd be someone's daughter, wife, or burden. Here, she's the main event. Quirky fact. Becoming a geisha required years of training, sometimes starting as early as age 6. Trainees, called maiko, studied music, dance, storytelling, and even regional dialects to suit different clients. They also had to learn how to fall without wrinkling their kimono, how to flirt without breaking eye contact, and how to say no in 20 different ways, none of which sounded like rejection. Later, as guests leave and lanterns are doused, you catch a glimpse of Chiyo walking alone across the garden. She's no longer performing. Her back is straight, but her shoulders sag a little, just enough to break your heart. You realise she probably makes more money than most men in the neighbourhood. She's respected, revered, but she's also stuck in a life that allows only curated fragments of herself to exist in public. Like the lacquerware she drinks from, beautiful, fragile and hollow in the middle. There's a scholarly debate, of course there is, about the line between geisha and sex workers. Some argue the line was fluid, that even high-ranking geisha sometimes engaged in private arrangements with wealthy patrons. Others insist the distinction was fiercely protected, and any woman who violated it was expelled. The reality seems to lie in the unspoken agreements between individuals, who pays, who expects, who consents. But one thing's clear, whatever their private lives entailed, geisha were not for sale in the same way courtesans were. You leave the tea house and step into the street, your ears still ringing faintly with the last notes of the shamisen. It's quiet now. The floating world is catching its breath. You pass the walls of the geisha house and wonder how many lives have been lived in there without ever being fully seen. You think of Chiyo, her painted smile, and the way she lowered her voice just slightly when she said, "There's power in being wanted. More power in choosing when not. To be? And maybe that's it. Geisha are the art of maybe. Of not quite. Of just enough. Sex isn't absent. It hovers, implied and unclaimed, like steam over tea. They are memory makers, not lovers. And when they leave a room, all that's left is the echo of their footsteps and the sudden unbearable quiet. You slip away from the quiet elegance of the geisha house and into a different part of the floating world, no less theatrical but far more chaotic. The air shifts again. The lanterns are brighter here, rowdier. The music is louder, and the laughter is definitely not rehearsed. You're walking through Yoshiwara's main strip, the heart of Edo's pleasure district. This isn't a subtle waltz of longing. This is a red lantern carnival of bodies, appetite, and illusion. Welcome to the true engine room of sex in feudal Japan, the licensed quarters where the business of pleasure was tightly controlled, obsessively structured, and somehow still completely wild. The government allowed these districts to exist for one reason: containment. They were official, legal zones where sex work could be taxed, monitored, and most importantly, kept away from polite society. But the result was its own little universe, sealed off from the outside world by moats, walls, and moral loopholes. Here, the streets are lined with brothels, tea houses, music parlours, and shops selling everything from hairpins to condoms made of tortoiseshell and animal membrane. Yeah, we'll get there. It's loud, messy, and dizzying. You try not to gawk, but you're definitely gawking. You duck into one of the larger brothels, 3 stories of carved wood, painted signs and faint perfume, and are instantly hit by a tidal wave of energy. There's a line of women behind latticed windows, half in shadow, half in candlelight. They aren't speaking, just watching. The customers stroll by like they're at a fish market, pointing, whispering, sometimes laughing too loud. When a man chooses a woman, a servant leads him upstairs while she quietly gathers her robes and follows. There's no flirtation, no game, just transaction. Historical fact: the Tokugawa shogunate designated specific pleasure quarters, like Yoshiwara in Edo, Shimabara in Kyoto, and Shinmachi in Osaka, as the only places where prostitution was legally allowed. Within these walls, the rules of the outside world bent. But outside those walls, total prohibition. The idea was to create a release valve for society while maintaining public morality. It sort of worked. Sort of. You follow a young customer, a merchant's son maybe, into one of the back rooms. The sex that unfolds is, to put it plainly, awkward. Not because either of them is doing anything wrong, but because this isn't intimacy. This is work. The woman, early 20s, practiced, goes through the motions with a kind of weary choreography. She isn't unkind, but she's clearly somewhere else. Her eyes drift toward the ceiling while he fumbles with his robe ties and tries not to look too eager. It's not unpleasant, it's just empty, polite, performed. After he leaves, she sits alone for a while, sipping lukewarm tea. She doesn't cry. She doesn't smile either. You realise she's probably done this 4 or 5 times today already, with more to come before sunrise. Her name is Sayuri, and she came here as a teenager, sold into debt by a family who couldn't pay their taxes. She's good at her job. Too good. That's why she's still here. Quirky fact: in the upper levels of the Yoshiwara brothel hierarchy, some women could earn temporary promotions or better accommodations based on how much income they generated. They even had internal rankings and public parades, where the top courtesans were displayed like royalty. But it didn't change the fact that most were trapped in debt contracts they couldn't escape without being bought out, which almost never happened. You wander deeper into the district as the night thickens. There's a house where musicians play rowdy shamisen songs while drunk men shout over each other. Another where a girl, barely 15, sits with her chin resting in her palm, clearly waiting for a customer she doesn't want. There are rooms that smell of sweat, sake, and forgotten stories, and all around you the city buzzes with the low, constant hum of people pretending they're not pretending. And then, something unexpected. In a quiet side parlour you find 2 women curled together on a futon, limbs tangled like vines. One is clearly a worker, the other, maybe a client, maybe a fellow worker, it's hard to say. But there's something different in how they touch. Not performance, not payment, just tenderness. A moment stolen out of the structure, lit softly by candlelight in the absence of men. You stay for only a second before backing out silently. Even here, in a system built to regulate desire, real affection sneaks through the cracks like smoke. There's a scholarly argument over how much autonomy brothel women actually had in districts like Yoshiwara. Some believe they developed strong internal cultures, with their own codes, hierarchies, even small rebellions, silent sisterhoods in a world of profit and performance. Others argue that no amount of ritual or ranking could disguise the cruelty of a system that commodified girlhood and trapped women in cycles of debt and exhaustion. Maybe both are true. Maybe survival in this place meant holding two truths in your heart at once. As you exit the pleasure quarters in the early morning light, the spell breaks a little. The buildings look shabbier, the painted signs a bit smudged. The laughter is gone, replaced by the scrape of brooms and the shuffle of tired feet. You pass Sayuri again on her way to fetch water. She doesn't notice you. She's somewhere else, thinking maybe of a life that could have been. Or maybe she isn't thinking at all. Sometimes you just go numb. Even in a place this bright, the cost of pleasure is paid in silence. The sun rises higher, washing over the rooftops of Yoshiwara, casting harsh clarity over a place that glows best in the dark. But you don't leave just yet. There's one more layer to peel back before you can walk away from the floating world. Today, you're stepping into the hidden arteries of the pleasure district, the alleys and inner rooms that support its glossy surface. The red light district isn't just about what happens upstairs in futon-lined chambers, it's about the systems beneath it, the law, the rituals, the economics. This is the bureaucracy of sex, and believe it or not, it's astonishingly well organised. The shogunate didn't legalise prostitution because it was lenient. It did it because it was obsessed with control. Everything in the licensed quarters was codified. Who could work, where they could live, how they dressed, even how they moved. At Yoshiwara's gates, guards kept track of everyone going in and out. Inside, brothel owners paid taxes, filed reports and submitted to inspections. The women? Registered, ranked and recorded in official documents. This wasn't a free-for-all, it was a spreadsheet in silk. You sit beside the district registrar, a weary, ink-stained official whose job it is to track the lives of dozens of courtesans. He opens a scroll and shows you the roster. Names, ages, fees, dates of service, rank status. Each woman is a line item, a body measured by profit. When one retires, another takes her place. Sometimes a girl arrives at 13, moves through training as a kamuro, becomes a full courtesan by 16, and is worn thin by 20. If she's lucky, a rich client buys her contract. If not, she ages out, her price drops, and she becomes background noise. Historical fact. In Edo period Yoshiwara, courtesans were organised into a caste system. At the top were the Taiyu or Oiran, elite, highly educated and extravagantly dressed. Below them came various lower-ranked women with far fewer privileges. The system was rigid, and climbing it required a combination of popularity, talent and sheer endurance. You're led through a side alley behind the main brothels where the real work happens. Servants haul water in buckets, wash linens stained with every kind of bodily evidence, and air out rooms between clients. A middle-aged woman, once a courtesan herself, now manages the scheduling board. She juggles clients, enforces rest periods, and ensures no one's double booked, unless money really talks. Her face is lined, her eyes sharp. She's part madam, part nurse, part prison warden. In one room, you watch a young woman have her hair styled for hours. Pins, wax, combs, the whole architectural miracle of Edo fashion. She sits motionless as two older women chatter about clients and news from outside the walls. For her, this hair isn't just vanity, it's identity. It marks her status, her availability, her value. A misplaced ornament could mean demotion. And hair this elaborate? You sleep sitting up, night after night, spine straight, dreams bent. Quirky fact, high-ranking courtesans wore elaborate outfits and hairstyles that could weigh over 20 pounds. Their sandals were intentionally designed to be awkward and loud, making it impossible to move quickly, or discreetly. That wasn't a design flaw, it was policy. Control wrapped in brocade. Later, you watch a group of clients gather in a tea house before their appointments. They're drunk before the first course. They joke about which courtesan's worth the price this week, comparing experiences like they're reviewing produce at the market. One man proudly says he plans to break a new girl tonight. The others laugh too hard. You watch the server flinch, just for a second before refilling their cups. And this is the other truth about the pleasure quarters. For all their art, elegance and performance, they often shielded predation behind protocol. Not all clients respected boundaries. Not all brothel managers protected their workers. The red lanterns might glow like a dream, but they cast long shadows. There's a scholarly debate around how much the rigid structure of Yoshiwara empowered women versus entrapping them. Some argue that by regulating the sex trade, the shogunate gave women a form of economic agency they lacked elsewhere: protection, legal recognition, even status. Others point out that the same structure commodified them so thoroughly that escape became nearly impossible. You wonder if both are right, or if that's just what it means to exist inside a beautiful cage. As night falls again, you sit beside the brothel gates and watch the district come alive. The lanterns flicker to life. The air thickens with perfume and pipe smoke. A group of men laugh as they stumble toward their appointments. Behind the lattice windows, women adjust their sashes and brace for the next performance. Nothing ever stops here. It just loops, over and over. You think of Sayuri again, and Hanai, and the girl with the shamisen voice. You think of the registrar with his ink-stained fingers and the hairdresser whose arms tremble from years of repetition. Everyone in Yoshiwara is performing, even the guests, even you, if you stay too long. But tonight, you leave through the front gate. Just once, before stepping out, you glance back, and in the doorway of a brothel a young woman lifts her eyes and meets yours. Her face is unreadable. She doesn't smile, doesn't bow. But she sees you. Not as a customer, not as a guest, just someone who walked through her world and remembered to look back. You think you've seen it all, right? You've slipped through silk screens, wandered behind brothel walls, heard whispers through temple halls. But tonight's detour isn't about what people did, it's about how they learned to do it. You find yourself in a cramped but well-lit room in an Edo merchant's home, staring down at a scroll that has clearly been unrolled a few too many times. The parchment is worn at the edges, the ink slightly faded. But the illustrations? Oh, they're vivid. Extremely vivid. Welcome to the surprisingly educational world of Japanese sex manuals. Part art, part instruction, part erotic confession. Call it Ancient N SFW, self-help. The man showing you the scroll is a bookseller. He smirks as he smooths the paper and explains that this one's popular with newlyweds, but also with bored husbands, curious students, and even the occasional monk pretending to shop for calligraphy practice sheets. The scroll itself, hand-painted with painstaking care, features couples locked in every position imaginable. One is acrobatic enough to cause a back injury. Another is clearly more spiritual than physical, involving incense, chanting, and something that looks suspiciously like a prayer bell in the wrong place. Historical fact: by the Edo period, illustrated sex manuals known as makura-e, pillow pictures, or shunpon, erotic books, had become widely circulated despite strict censorship. These weren't just for titillation. They often served as practical guides, offering advice on foreplay, anatomy, performance anxiety, and even aphrodisiacs. The bookseller points to one passage written in flowing cursive. It translates loosely as, "A woman is like the sea, gentle when calm, overwhelming in storm." Poetic, sure. But the next section is more specific. Detailed diagrams showing the locations of pleasure centres, with notes on how many fingers to use and what sounds to expect. And yes, it gets very anatomical. There's even an awkward diagram of male anatomy next to an open teacup with the caption, "The vessel must fit the pore." Subtle. You move to another scroll, clearly older, where a narrator speaks directly to the reader in a friendly, no-nonsense tone. Do not rush. Rushing is for rabbits and merchants late to market. A woman's flower must bloom with patience. Another page offers breathing exercises. Another provides a recipe for a mysterious tonic involving lotus root sake and powdered deer horn. The line between sex advice and witchcraft gets a little fuzzy here. Quirky fact: some Edo sex manuals were illustrated by famous artists who also did mainstream work, painters and printmakers, whose names now hang in museums. They often published erotic art under pseudonyms to protect their reputations. One day, you're drawing landscapes for the shogun. The next, you're sketching two lovers tangled in a noodle cart. What's striking isn't just the detail, it's the tone. These guides don't treat sex as shameful or crude. They treat it like any other skill, something to study, to practice, to improve. And they don't put all the pressure on men either. Many sections focus on a woman's pleasure, with tips like, "Do not fall asleep after your own joy. She will think you are dead or bored. Neither is acceptable." You step back as another customer enters, a woman in her 30s, casually dressed, shopping without embarrassment. She picks up a small woodblock booklet, flips through the illustrations and nods. You expect her to blush or giggle, but she simply hands over the coins and tucks it into her sleeve. For her, it's just another purchase, maybe a gift, maybe research. And here's the thing, these books were often read together, husbands and wives, lovers, even friends. In a world where marriages were arranged and sex could be awkwardly navigated, these manuals offered a shared language, a way to laugh, explore and understand. Sure, some were explicit, bordering on the absurd, but many were thoughtful, even kind. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether these texts were empowering or objectifying. Some argue they encouraged mutual satisfaction and destigmatized desire. Others point out the gendered assumptions, the idealized female forms, the coded language of control. As always, it depends on the reader and the writer. The bookseller offers you a final scroll. This one is different. Less clinical, more artistic. A series of lovers caught in tender moments, not just during sex but before and after. A man brushing a woman's hair, a woman tying a sash around a man's wrist, a couple watching the moon, naked under their robes, but not touching, just being. The caption reads, "The body opens when the heart is quiet." You leave the shop under a slowly rising moon, the scroll still flickering in your mind. You think of all the couples, farmers, samurai, courtesans, monks, trying to make sense of their own hunger. Maybe these manuals helped. Maybe they confused more than they clarified, but they existed, openly, proudly, lovingly even. In a world that often regulated sex to control people, these books did the opposite. They offered knowledge. They whispered, "You're not alone in wanting more." And in doing so, they made space, for curiosity, for connection, for quiet joy under a fluttering screen. You're still drifting through Edo, trailing behind candlelight and curiosity, when you hear something strange. Not the clack of guitar on wooden planks, not the gentle scrape of a shamisen. No, this is a moan. Soft at first, then sharper. The kind of sound that turns heads, even in a place where such things aren't exactly rare. You follow it through a sliding door into a dim little room where two lovers lie twisted together on a futon, and between them, sitting upright, reading aloud in a very serious voice, is a woman holding an open scroll. You freeze. She doesn't. She reads the next line. At the height of passion, the voice must rise like a crane taking flight. The man stifles a laugh. The woman on the futon tries to follow instructions, emitting a rather dramatic whimper that sounds more like a flute being stepped on. The reader sighs. Number, that's too bird-like. Try again. You've stumbled into something unusual. A vocal coaching session for sex. Welcome to the overlooked art of erotic sound. It turns out that during the Edo period, people didn't just think about what sex should look like, they had strong opinions about what it should sound like too. Moaning, sighing, breath control. It was all part of the performance. Manuals and pillow books from the time included entire sections devoted to the proper noises, including what was considered desirable, what was embarrassing, and what could possibly drive a partner to distraction, in both the good and bad ways. Historical fact. Some Edo-era sex guides didn't stop at body positions and timing. They offered precise instructions on how and when to vocalize during intimacy. For women, soft sighs and breathy moans were encouraged. For men, less was more, except during climax, when a well-timed exhale was supposed to prove both virility and aesthetic restraint. You sit quietly as the lesson continues. The reader, likely a retired courtesan or someone with considerable experience, asks her student to try again. This time, the woman lies back, closes her eyes, and emits a delicate, almost musical sigh. The reader nods. Better. Feel it in your stomach, not your throat. Don't sound like you're coughing. You're weirdly impressed. This is like voice acting for desire. The man leans in, intrigued. Should I moan too? He asks, voice cracking slightly. The reader gives him a withering look. Only if you want to sound like a dying tanuki. Quirky fact. In some underground theatrical performances and erotic recordings, yes, those existed even in the 1700s, actors would perform pleasure noises as part of the show. These were rehearsed, sometimes stylized to the point of absurdity. Imagine a sex scene directed by someone obsessed with the rhythm of poetry. It's a lot. There's something almost sweet about how seriously the students take this. They aren't here to be sexy. They're here to learn how to be believably sexy, how to make a partner feel wanted, how to build heat with breath, how not to accidentally ruin the moment by grunting like a wrestler falling down a well. You think of all the other things people practice: tea ceremony, archery, flower arranging. Why not this? But as the lesson goes on, you also notice the strain. The woman hesitates before each moan. The man flinches when told he's too nasal. They're trying to sound desirable, but they're also clearly worried about being judged. You realise how easily something meant to express pleasure becomes a performance with rules and expectations. One wrong note, and suddenly you're not doing it right. There's an open scholarly debate, of course there is, about whether these practices empowered or constrained people, especially women. Some historians argue that teaching erotic sounds gave women a way to assert agency in intimate situations, to guide, to influence, to seduce. Others say it reduced them to instruments, reinforcing the idea that a woman's pleasure was for her partner's validation, not her own. You sit with both thoughts. The truth hums somewhere in between, like a sigh caught in the back of a throat. After the lesson, the reader rolls up her scroll and reminds the couple to practice daily. But only if you're both in the mood. Don't force the song. No one wants to hear an unwilling solo. You follow her outside into the alley, where she lights a small pipe and leans against the wooden wall, exhaling smoke into the dark. She tells you, casually, that sound was everything in her day. The silence of a good listener, the rhythm of a skilled lover's breath, the hum of approval when someone did just the right thing. We didn't talk about it much, she says, but we always heard it. You leave her there, pipe glowing like a firefly in the dark, and walk back through the quiet streets. You start listening, not for voices exactly, but for the breath of the city, the distant creak of a futon, the rustle of a robe, the soft rhythmic murmur of two people somewhere, finding a shared note. Maybe sex isn't just touch and heat and movement. Maybe it's music too. And maybe, just maybe, the most honest thing we do in bed is make noise. Not to perform, not to impress, but because the body has things to say when the mouth forgets how to speak. The sun is low again, casting warm gold across wooden rooftops and the occasional trailing silk sash caught in a breeze. You've drifted further into the heart of Edo, and this time your feet take you down a narrow back street that smells faintly of old ink, camellia oil, and something earthy. A sign creaks above you, painted in calligraphy too fancy to be honest about what's inside. But you know, everyone does. Because in this particular shop, bound carefully in rice paper and sold under the counter with a sideways glance, is one of feudal Japan's most cherished indulgences, Shunga, the erotic woodblock prints that manage to be artistic, explicit, hilarious, and taboo all at once. You slide through the door and into a room that looks deceptively refined. Scrolls on the wall, tea kettle warming on the coals, but the stack on the table? Oh yeah, that's where things get interesting. The prints are colourful, hand-pressed with ink still bright after decades. And what's on them? Sex. Lots of it. Graphic, cartoonishly exaggerated, full-throttle scenes that leave absolutely nothing to the imagination, except maybe how people are physically managing these positions without pulling a hamstring. Historical fact: Shunga, meaning spring pictures, were a popular genre of Japanese woodblock prints during the Edo period. Nearly every major ukiyo-e artist, including the great Hokusai, created shunga at some point. Despite occasional censorship efforts, these prints were widely owned, often hidden among more respectable books, and considered good luck charms. Yes, really. You pick up a print of a fisherman and his wife entangled on a beach. Waves crash in the background. Clothes flutter mid-air. Their facial expressions are wild, ecstatic, and also slightly ridiculous. That's part of the charm. Shunga doesn't try to be subtle. It's joyful, physical, unfiltered. The genitals are enormous, the angles improbable, and yet, somehow, it feels realer than the poetry-laced seduction of the court or the choreographed sighs of a brothel. There's another print. A couple caught mid-tryst under a plum tree, their bodies half exposed, surrounded by fallen petals. It's beautiful and also deeply logistical. The artist clearly cared about composition, but also had questions about anatomy and flexibility that they decided to answer with wild, glorious commitment. And yes, Hokusai's famous "Dream of the Fisherman's Wife" is here too. Tentacles and all. You stare for a long time, you blink, then you stare again. We'll just leave that one there. Quirky fact, Shunga was sometimes given to newlyweds as part of a dowry or marriage starter kit. The idea was that these prints would educate and encourage intimacy, part erotic manual, part fertility talisman, part light entertainment for awkward first nights. As you leaf through more prints, you start noticing details beyond the obvious. Facial expressions, sly grins, embarrassed giggles, flushed cheeks. These aren't idealized, lifeless figures. They're people, flawed, excited, occasionally confused. And the more you look, the more you realize that Shunga isn't just about sex. It's about humanity. There's humor. There's surprise. There's the guy in the corner who's clearly trying to join in and clearly not invited. A customer enters, an older man with the calm confidence of someone who's bought a lot of these. He chats with the shopkeeper about a new series just in, wrapped in plain fabric. They unroll it carefully and admire the artistry. One scene shows a samurai in full armour being disrobed by a courtesan with a look of victory on her face. Another features two women alone, laughing, tangled in each other with no man in sight. The old man chuckles. "That one's for collectors," he says. You realise then that these prints served many purposes. They were private pleasures, certainly, but also social commentary, parody, wish fulfillment. They showed sex in all its strange glory, between husbands and wives, lovers and rivals, humans and sometimes sea creatures. They didn't shy away from taboo. They ran straight at it, ink flying. There's still scholarly debate over the function of Shunga in everyday life. Were they subversive tools of empowerment, harmless fun, evidence of a more open, playful sexual culture? Or did they reflect and maybe reinforce social hierarchies and gender roles in eroticized form? Some scholars argue they gave voice to female pleasure in ways literature rarely did. Others caution against romanticizing an art form that could also objectify, flatten and commodify desire. The truth, as always, may lie somewhere between the laughter and the arousal. Before you leave, the shopkeeper offers you a print for free, one that's slightly damaged, its edges torn. You unroll it. It's a couple, clearly older, lounging together on a veranda. They're naked, yes, but not performing, just leaning against each other, smiling. They're Seki, a kitten, a half-finished meal. It's oddly tender. Real. You roll it back up, grateful. Outside, the sun has nearly vanished. The lanterns of the red light district flicker to life behind you, but you turn the other way, tucking the scroll under your arm. Shunga might be erotic, exaggerated, scandalous, but it's also a reminder that sex, for all its complications, was once depicted with laughter, with colour, with the full ridiculousness of human bodies trying and failing and trying again. And maybe that's something worth holding on to. Even after you leave the little print shop and its piles of enthusiastic bodies frozen in ink, the images follow you, lingering like a melody you can't shake. But the next place you go is quieter, slower, almost reverent. You find yourself on the edge of a modest townhouse, where a woman in a simple but immaculately tied kimono prepares tea. No blush, no coy smiles, no elaborate hairpieces, just presence, composure. She offers you a seat, pours tea into a ceramic cup, and then fixes you with a look so steady you almost forget to blink. This is not a courtesan, not a geisha, not someone playing a part. She's just a woman. And tonight you're going to sit with her and finally hear the part of the story that too often gets left out. What pleasure meant to women in feudal Japan. Not performance, not illusion, but the real stuff, if and when they managed to find it. The biggest myth, she tells you, as if she's been reading your mind, is that women didn't care about sex. That it was something done to them, endured for the sake of family, reputation, or duty. And while that certainly happened, and happened often, it's not the whole picture. Across all classes, women had thoughts, desires, preferences. Sometimes they even wrote them down. She reaches into a drawer and pulls out a small book. The handwriting is elegant, deliberate, unmistakably feminine. It's a pillow book. Part diary, part catalogue of thoughts, part erotic monologue. You read snippets aloud, your voice dropping into a whisper without even realising it. One passage describes the feeling of anticipation as a lover removes her outer robe. Another complains about a man who rushed like a deer through the reeds. There's humour, longing, sarcasm. One line reads, "He praised my scent, then fell asleep before discovering its source." Useless. Historical fact, the Makura no Soshi, pillow book, by Sei Shonagon, written in the Heian period, included frank observations on everything from court fashion to intimate encounters, and many lesser-known female writers followed suit in private diaries, often addressing topics like sexual compatibility, disappointment, and the rare but treasured experience of mutual satisfaction. The woman across from you pours more tea. She tells you about a friend of hers, long gone now, who once refused to sleep with her husband for a week after he praised another woman's calligraphy in public. Not because she was jealous, she says, but because he clearly valued her brain and didn't sleep with her. You realise in that moment how much desire, especially for women, was about being seen, not just touched. You learn that in some eras and regions women actively sought lovers outside their marriages. Discretion was expected, but not necessarily condemnation. And even within marriage, a woman might dictate the pace, the timing, even the location of intimacy. You hear stories of wives leaving subtle cues, incense, hair oil, a folded robe left strategically on the floor to signal interest. If their husbands missed the signs, their loss. Quirky fact, some pillow books and sex guides explicitly included instructions for men on how to pleasure women, often in humorous or sarcastic tones. One section advised, "Do not ask if she is done. If she is still there, you are not." Another warned against poor hygiene in a way that can only be described as poetically scathing. And while much of this remained behind closed doors or hidden in private journals, a surprising amount filtered into the broader culture. You hear tales of women writing erotic poetry to each other, of older women advising younger ones with alarming frankness, of lovers rating past partners not just by stamina, but by listening skills. You're told that in some districts, women's brothels existed, not just for men, but for women seeking other women. Quiet places where intimacy didn't require male approval. There's a scholarly divide on how widespread female sexual agency really was. Some historians argue that most women, especially outside the elite, were bound by patriarchal norms too strict to allow real autonomy. Others believe that private lives were more complex, that within marriages, behind curtains, and in whispers among friends, women found and created spaces for pleasure on their own terms. As with most things, the answer lies somewhere between silence and subversion. The woman across from you is older now. You can tell by the way she refolds her sleeves with practiced care, by the calm in her voice. She's not bitter, but she remembers. She says softly, "You can love someone and still be lonely in your body. You can give someone your life, but not your joy." You sit with that. It echoes longer than you expect. Before you leave, she hands you a small slip of paper folded into fourths. On it, a poem in her own handwriting. "He touched my wrist, and not my heart, and wondered why I stayed still." She doesn't explain it. She doesn't have to. As you step outside, the air feels different. Not colder, just clearer. You walk past houses where women cook, sew, argue, laugh. Most of their stories won't be written down. But that doesn't mean they didn't want, ache, delight, or decide. In a world that often told them what to do with their bodies, many women still found ways to claim them. In poems, in pillow books, in silence, or in a glance that says, "I remember exactly how I like to be touched, and whether or not you knew how to do it." You wake up this time in a narrow room, where everything smells faintly of camphor and crushed herbs. It's not a pleasure house, not a temple, not even someone's home. It's a kind of clinic, though clinic is a generous word. There's a wooden table, shelves of tiny ceramic jars, and a woman in a grey robe grinding something that smells like disappointment and desperation. You're about to learn the side of sex that nobody writes poems about. How people in feudal Japan tried not to get pregnant, or tried to get pregnant, or tried to make the whole process a little less random. Tonight, you're exploring birth control, Edo style. Strap in. It's going to be weird. The woman at the mortar is a kajiya-basan, a midwife and herbalist, trusted by the neighbourhood for everything from delivering breech babies to diagnosing mystery fevers to, yes, helping women avoid or terminate unwanted pregnancies. She's discreet, blunt, and terrifyingly knowledgeable. You watch as she mixes a paste from mashed persimmon root, powdered mugwort, and dried silkworm droppings. You really wish that last part was a joke. She spreads the mixture onto a folded bit of mulberry paper, hands it to a pale woman seated nearby, and tells her, deadpan, to place it where the moonlight doesn't reach. The woman doesn't ask questions. She just bows, tucks the paper into her sleeve, and leaves. You're left blinking. What exactly did you just witness? Historical fact. In feudal Japan, a range of folk methods were used for birth control, including herbal pessaries, natural sponges soaked in vinegar or sake, coitus interruptus, nakadashi kinshi, or forbidden pouring, and periodic abstinence based on lunar cycles. Some methods were harmless, others range from ineffective to dangerous. You move to the shelf, where jars are labelled with phrases like rabbit gall, foxglove ash, and bitter cucumber. The midwife explains that some herbs are meant to prevent conception, others induce miscarriage, and while men rarely take responsibility for birth control, women, especially those in sex work or unstable marriages, learn fast. A single mistake can cost them their livelihood, their freedom, or their life. She shows you an odd contraption, a thin horn cup curved and polished smooth. It's a kind of condom, made from tortoiseshell or animal, bladder washed and reused until it splits. Not exactly seductive. You hold it up to the light, it crackles faintly, you put it down very quickly. Quirky fact, one of the more commonly used barriers was a soft paper diaphragm soaked in bamboo vinegar and inserted before sex. Some women even use seaweed. And while condoms existed, they were expensive and usually reserved for brothels. Clients who brought their own, considered classy, and also suspiciously well prepared. Later, a younger girl arrives, barely 16. She doesn't speak. The midwife doesn't need her to. She lays her down, lights incense, and presses gently on her belly. No heartbeat yet, but the signs are clear. The girl stares at the ceiling. Her hands tremble. You ask the midwife if she can help. She shrugs, then nods toward a dark brown liquid warming in a cup over the fire. It's made from unripe peach pits, powdered mercury, and cloves. It's risky. It might work, it might not. Either way, it's all she has. There's no ritual here, no prayer, just a sip, and then silence. There's a growing academic debate over how much knowledge common women really had about reproductive control. Some argue that midwives and herbalists shared techniques across generations, maintaining oral traditions of body wisdom that gave women at least a sliver of agency. Others claim this knowledge was inconsistent, riddled with myth, and too often lethal. What's clear is that access to care and to safety depended entirely on who you knew and how quietly you asked. Outside, the streets are beginning to stir. A cart rattles by. A mother scolds her son for peeing in the gutter. Life goes on. Inside, the girl curls up in a corner, resting. The midwife returns to her mortar. There's always another paste to make. You leave the room, the scent of bitter herbs still clinging to your clothes, and walk through a narrow alley toward the river. You pass a group of women washing laundry. One of them is visibly pregnant, laughing as she struggles to lift a soaked kimono from the water. Another one, older, eyes sharp, whispers something into her ear. The pregnant woman smirks. Whatever was said wasn't sweet. You realise then that even in the most structured, male-dominated aspects of this society, there was a hidden world of knowledge passed between women. Quiet advice in bathhouses, warnings muttered under breath, powdered roots traded in corners. They didn't always work. They weren't always safe. But they existed. And in a world where a woman's fate could hinge on whether or not she conceived, they were everything. That night, back in your room, you hear footsteps on the street below. Someone else heading to the midwife's. Maybe with a lover's secret. Maybe with fear. Maybe with hope. You wonder how many women made these journeys. How many whispered the same questions into smoke-filled kitchens. How many, even now, carry the taste of mugwort on their tongue and a memory no one will ever speak aloud. Not all of feudal Japan was embroidered robes and moonlit poetry. Sometimes it was a girl with shaking hands, a teacup of poison, and a quiet decision made in a room that smelled like ash and blood and courage. You wake to the scratch of a brush on paper. Not poetry this time. Not a love note slipped under a screen or a midnight haiku meant to stir someone's loins. This paper isn't romantic. It's brief, cold, final. A single sentence that ends a relationship, a household, sometimes an entire family's carefully arranged reputation. You're looking at a mikudarihan, a traditional Japanese divorce letter, and all it takes is one line, just 7 kanji. I hereby divorce thee. That's it. No court, no arguing, no lawyers, no alimony, no chance to say anything clever in return. One brushstroke, and you're out. Divorce in feudal Japan was surprisingly common, at least for men. A husband could issue a mikudarihan at will, provided the wife wasn't pregnant and had somewhere to go. And by somewhere, we usually mean back to her natal family, who might or might not welcome her. If he was feeling generous, he'd include some rice or household goods. If he wasn't, good luck. Historical fact. The mikudarihan was often pre-written in bulk, sometimes with blanks to be filled in later. It required no official stamp or government approval, only the man's will and signature. A wife could not unilaterally divorce her husband, though in rare cases she could appeal through family networks or, even more rarely, legal petitions. You trail a man through the market. He looks ordinary, middle-aged, sandals worn, hair neatly tied back. Nothing about him suggests he's about to drop a personal bomb. But when he steps into a shop and quietly hands over a folded piece of paper to the shopkeeper, who happens to be his wife's brother, you realise it's happening. No shouting, no explanation. He just nods and leaves. The shopkeeper sighs, rubs his temples and mutters, "Third time this year." You find the wife later, sitting behind the counter, still processing. She isn't crying, she's angry, and also not surprised. This wasn't about infidelity or abuse. It was about incompatibility, and in her case, infertility. 2 miscarriages, no sons. The husband moved on, left her with the shop, and vanished into another town. She says she'll manage. She always does. But not every split was so clean. You hear stories, lots of them, about marriages collapsing under more dramatic circumstances. A woman in Kyoto who allegedly threw her husband's armour into the river after catching him with a courtesan. A samurai's wife who forged his mikudarihan and handed it to him, daring him to contest it. A merchant's widow who kept the house after her husband left and turned it into a tea house where she got to choose her clients. Not exactly legal, but bold? Absolutely. Quirky fact. Some women kept hidden emergency. Mikudarihan documents their husbands had signed preemptively, either in drunken moments or as romantic gestures gone terribly wrong. If the marriage soured, they pulled it out like a talisman. Surprise! You divorced me 2 years ago and didn't even remember. But of course, not all relationships ended in quiet exits or clever power plays. Some ended in betrayal, violence, revenge. You overhear 2 servants gossiping about a samurai who returned from campaign to find his wife had taken a younger lover, a junior retainer. The lover disappeared. The wife claimed innocence. The samurai filed the divorce scroll, then donated her to a convent. No trial, no public scandal, just erased. You walk through a small shrine where discarded mikudarihan have been tied to tree branches, left to flutter in the wind. Each paper a life split in 2. Some are covered in scribbles, angry rebuttals, names crossed out, new ones added. Others are plain. Just the one sentence. You watch a woman in a faded robe tie her own letter to the branch. Her face is unreadable. You get the sense she wasn't the one who wrote it. But tying it here, that's her version of closure. There's a scholarly debate around the frequency and implications of divorce in feudal Japan. Some argue the process gave men too much unchecked power and reinforced patriarchal control. Others note that divorce, while unequal, was at least more accessible and socially tolerated than in many other pre-modern societies. Women from lower classes often remarried. Widows and divorcees could rebuild lives, particularly if they had skills, land, or supportive family networks. Autonomy existed, just in the cracks. As the day wanes, you visit a matchmaker, a no-nonsense older woman with a ledger full of names and notes. She tells you that for every divorce she hears about, there's a family waiting to rematch the daughter, ideally with someone of equal or lesser baggage. Everyone lies, she says, especially about why it ended, but if they bring enough rice or a decent dowry, I can usually find someone willing to pretend none of it happened. Before you leave, She hands you a sample Mikudarihan. It's blank except for the line at the top. Just 7 characters. Written in the same ink as wedding vows, family records, birth announcements. You realise then how fragile these ties were. How much of love, marriage and duty rested on ink, on pride, on silence. As you walk away through the evening crowds, you wonder how many people around you are holding onto folded papers in their sleeves, thinking about delivering them, or burning them, or rewriting them. Because in this world, love might start with a poem, but it could end with a single sentence and a quietly closed door. You find yourself in a room that feels more like a spell than a structure. No windows, no doors you can see, just paper charms hanging from the rafters, each one marked with a smear of ink, a strand of hair, or something darker. In the centre sits a woman dressed in layers of black and crimson, her face half shadowed by a hood. She doesn't acknowledge you right away. She's busy tying a knot into a straw doll's chest with fingers that move like they've done this thousands of times. Tonight you're stepping into the other side of desire, the irrational, the occult, the desperate. This is where love stops being romantic and starts getting dangerous. You've wandered into the world of love spells, curses and charms, where lust can lead you straight to madness. The woman, some call her a kanagi, others a witch, some just an old widow with too much time and too many secrets, finally glances up. Her eyes don't ask questions. They simply weigh you, decide you're harmless, and go back to work. Before her are small bowls filled with powdered jade, ox blood, and a folded letter written in an elegant hand. The ink is fresh, so is the blood. Someone's wish has arrived. She tells you, without needing to be asked, that love magic is common, more common than anyone admits. Young women come for attraction spells. Older women come to keep their husbands from wandering. Men come with different motives, often crueler. Some want affection, others want obsession, a few want revenge. People think sex is natural, she mutters, but what they really want is control. Love makes people stupid. Magic makes them bold. Historical fact. In feudal Japan, kuchios, summoning, and noroi, curses, were common forms of folk magic, often used in matters of the heart. Spells could involve writing the desired person's name on a charm, tying knots in dolls, or nailing effigies to sacred trees during the witching hour. These rituals weren't just folklore, they were feared, practiced, and in some cases, prosecuted. The woman picks up another doll, this one wrapped in silk with a lock of long black hair tied around the waist. She whispers over it, then places it gently into a cloth pouch with herbs and what looks like salt. This one's to bring someone back, she says. They left too soon, or maybe didn't want to leave at all. You don't ask what that means. Later a customer arrives, a young samurai, his face tense, eyes red from drink or grief. He places a small wooden token on the floor and bows. The woman nods. He doesn't need to explain. You watch as she mixes ash and crushed sakura petals into a bowl of sake, then whispers a name into the cup. Drink this at dusk. Think of her as you sleep. Dream of her 3 nights in a row, and she'll return. Or she won't, and you'll learn. He pays, bows again, and leaves. You stay behind, the air heavy with incense and intention. Quirky fact. Some love spells involved writing the target's name on a piece of parchment, soaking it in menstrual blood or a mixture of sake and ashes, and then slipping it into their clothing or food. Others required burying an item, like a hair comb or sash, near the targets. Home during a full moon. Subtle? Number creepy? Absolutely. You're shown a darker ritual, not for attraction, for punishment. The woman unrolls a cloth revealing nails, red twine, and a waraningyo, a straw doll with a painted face and tiny kimono. This one betrayed, she says, almost with pity. Said one thing, did another. Left someone alone in bed for too many nights. She doesn't explain who or when, but she hands you the doll, and for a moment it's shockingly heavy in your palm. You put it down. Outside you find yourself in a quiet shrine grove, and then you see it. A sacred pine, its trunk scarred with faint rust-coloured streaks. Nail heads barely visible, old charms fluttering from its branches like ghostly confessions. This is where people bring their curses at night, when no one is supposed to watch. But you're watching now. There's scholarly debate about how real these rituals were, and whether people actually believed in them, or used them more as psychological release. Some historians argue that spells and curses were expressions of power for those who otherwise had none, especially women in abusive or unequal relationships. Others suggest these were desperation rituals, driven more by grief than strategy. Either way, they weren't just theatre. For those who used them, they were last resorts. You leave the grove as dusk settles, passing another woman heading in the opposite direction, a bundle in her arms. Her face is blank, her footsteps sure. You don't ask what's in the bundle, you already know. That night, you lie awake on your futon, every creak of the house sounding sharper than usual. You think about all the people who turned to spells because words failed, because letters weren't answered, because sex stopped being mutual and started feeling like a game someone else was winning. You wonder how many charms still linger, folded into pillows, hidden in walls, burned in midnight fires, wishes made in whispers, love tangled with desperation. And maybe that's what magic really is. The moment when wanting turns into doing. When longing curls into a knot and begs to be undone no matter the cost. It's morning now, but you wouldn't know it from the inside of the theatre. The heavy curtain muffles the sun, the air is thick with stage dust, and backstage. Backstage is chaos wrapped in silk. You've entered a world where the line between gender, performance and desire dissolves like powdered makeup in warm rain. Welcome to the Kabuki theatre, where men play women, women sometimes play men, and the audience falls in love with illusions that wear wooden sandals and paint their emotions on with a brush. And if you think this is just a show, well, you haven't met the actors off stage. A flurry of noise surrounds you. Stagehands duck beneath ropes, an assistant races past with a bundle of hairpieces, and in the centre of it all, sitting calmly, while two apprentices apply eyeliner with the precision of calligraphers, is a young onagata, a male actor who specialises in playing female roles. He blinks slowly, accustomed to being stared at, though it's not quite clear whether it's him or her you're looking at. That's the point. In Kabuki, gender isn't a fact, it's an atmosphere. He's playing a courtesan tonight, one of the great tragic beauties of the stage. You watch as he adjusts the way he holds his hands, softening the wrists, curling his fingers like petals. When he speaks, even his voice has shifted, sliding an octave into something airy, melodic, not fake, not mockery, just transformation. It's not drag, it's ritual. And yes, it's seductive as hell. Historical fact. From the mid-1600s onward, women were banned from performing in Kabuki, partly to curb the immoral behaviour happening between actresses and audience members. Their roles were taken over by male actors, and a new art form emerged, one where gender was mimicked, stylised, and worshipped. The most beloved onagata were sex symbols in their own right, attracting admirers of every gender. You follow the actor, stage name Yukinosuke, real name unknown, as he finishes dressing. The transformation is eerie in its completeness. Layers of silk, an obi so wide he can't sit down, a wig heavy enough to require neck training. But his eyes are alert, playful. He winks at you before stepping through the curtains. You watch from the wings as the performance begins. A slow, tragic story unfolds. A courtesan betrayed by her lover, left to wander the city in disgrace, dying of heartbreak on the bridge at sunrise. Yukinosuke's performance is astonishing. He moves with the fragility of someone stitched together by longing. He cries on cue. When he gasps during the final act, half the audience gasps too. There's no illusion. He is the courtesan, if only for tonight. But here's where things get interesting. After the curtain falls and the applause fades, Yukinosuke doesn't become himself again. Not entirely. In the dressing room, he speaks to fans, some male, some female, with the same soft tone. You notice the way one admirer leans in a little too close. They aren't talking about the play anymore. They're asking if he's available, for tea, for something more. You learn quickly that many Kabuki actors, especially on Nagata, had lovers off stage, often blurring the lines between performance and personal life. Admirers fell in love not just with the actor, but with the character. Some paid handsomely for attention, gifts, even brief affairs. In the floating world, where illusion ruled, who you loved mattered less than how you loved. Quirky fact, Kabuki theatres were sometimes known as secret meeting places for same-sex couples or flirtations. The erotic tension between audience and actors was part of the draw. and in many cases popular actors maintained relationships with wealthy male patrons, relationships that weren't necessarily hidden, nor particularly scandalous. You speak with another performer backstage, a woman who plays male roles in smaller travelling kabuki troupes, less restricted than the big city theatres. She tells you how audiences shift depending on who she plays. As a man, I get bows. As a woman, I get pity, she says. But when I'm neither, they fall in love. There's an ongoing scholarly debate, because of course there is, about whether kabuki challenged or reinforced traditional gender roles. Some believe the art form subverted expectations, offering fluidity and visibility in a society that otherwise enforced rigid norms. Others argue that kabuki merely performed freedom while keeping actual power structures intact. But when you see Yuki Nosuke apply lipstick in the mirror with steady hands, it's hard not to feel that something radical happened here. As evening falls, you follow him through the alleys behind the theatre. He's out of costume now, but not entirely. There's still a softness to the way he walks, a kind of lingering artifice. A young merchant spots him, approaches, bows too deeply, and asks if they might walk together. Yuki Nosuke says yes, casually, like it happens every day. Maybe it does. You walk alone in the opposite direction, listening to the echoes of stage voices and soft sandals on stone. You pass a shop selling actor portraits, woodblock prints of famous onagata, posed with flirtatious glances, lips slightly parted. They look down at you, frozen in forever performance, and you wonder how many hearts they broke without ever meaning to. In kabuki, everyone plays a role. Sometimes even after the curtain falls, the applause from the kabuki theatre has barely faded before the air changes again. It's heavier now, stickier. You find yourself in a courtroom, except there are no powdered wigs or grand speeches here, just bamboo mats, a few scribes, and a middle-aged magistrate who looks like he'd rather be anywhere else. The air smells faintly of sweat and old ink, and from the way everyone is fidgeting, you get the feeling this trial is not your average case of stolen rice or drunken brawling. No, this one's different. You're about to witness what happens when sex mixes with betrayal and ends in blood. These are the crimes of passion, and they weren't as rare as you'd think. The defendant is a samurai's wife, seated with quiet dignity, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her face is blank, but her eyes have already been through hell. The charge? Murder. Specifically the murder of her husband, stabbed while he slept. And yes, she did it. No one's denying that. What everyone is arguing about is why. The prosecutors claim jealousy, that she discovered an affair and flew into a rage. The defense claims long-standing abuse, humiliation, and months of her husband spending more time in brothels than in his own home. You sit in the back watching the scribes struggle to keep up as details emerge. Affairs, public, shame, even a hidden will. Historical fact: crimes related to sexual jealousy or betrayal, particularly those involving samurai households, were sometimes tried with surprising nuance. While the law was strict, punishment could be influenced by social standing, motive, and public sentiment. Samurai women, in rare cases, could avoid execution by entering a nunnery or dying by suicide in exchange for preserving family honour. The court listens, unmoved. The woman never raises her voice. She simply tells them what happened, that she waited until he was drunk, that she used the blade he kept by the bed, that she wrapped his body in his ceremonial robe before calling for help. He dishonoured me, she says, and I gave him back to his ancestors. That's it. No tears. The magistrate sighs. The sentence is passed. Exile to a remote convent. She bows once, doesn't flinch. As the room clears, you catch whispers from the onlookers. Some call her monstrous. Others call her brave. One older woman mutters that she should have gone for the courtesan instead. Let the man live with his shame. You leave the courthouse and follow one of the scribes as he heads home. He tells you this wasn't even the week's most scandalous case. There was another. 2 brothers who fought to the death over a servant girl they both loved. And before that, a wakashu who killed his samurai lover after being cast aside for a wealthier companion. People think warriors die in battle, the scribe says, but most of them die for love, or lust, or something they can't even name. Quirky fact: popular woodblock prints often depicted real-life love murder cases, turning tragic lovers into celebrities. People collected these like tabloid magazines, passing them around like scandalous bedtime stories. Some even wrote songs about them, turning gruesome events into urban legend. Later, you visit a small memorial shrine tucked between a row of shops. It's unassuming, just a weathered stone with names carved into it. But the offerings tell the story. Wilted flowers, half-empty sake bottles, a scrap of red cloth tied around the base. This is a lover's shrine, erected in memory of a woman who killed herself and her lover after being forbidden to marry him. Local teenagers still leave offerings here, hoping for romantic luck, or at least not to end up like the couple who made this place famous. You overhear a tea merchant talking about a recent case, a merchant's wife who poisoned her husband's tea, not because he cheated, but because he ignored her for years. A quiet death for a quiet pain, he says, almost with admiration. He didn't even see it coming. There's a scholarly debate, naturally, about how to interpret these acts. Were they desperate grabs at agency in a world where women had little control over their lives? Were they mental breaks, romanticised tragedies? Or were they the logical conclusions of systems that pushed people into marriages they didn't choose, lives they didn't want, and expectations they couldn't possibly meet? Probably all of the above. You spend the evening in a small tea house near the court district. It's quiet. A few men sit alone, sipping slowly, lost in their thoughts. A woman with ink-stained fingers sketches a face into her notebook. You peek. It's the samurai's wife, captured in profile. She looks peaceful, not dangerous, not vengeful, just done. As you leave, you realise how often sex and violence were neighbours in this world. Not because people were crueler than they are now, but because so much was repressed, arranged, unspoken. A courtesan smiles too sweetly at the wrong guest. A wife receives one too many silences. A lover watches another's back as it turns one final time. And somewhere, a blade waits under a pillow. Love might begin with a glance, but in feudal Japan the end could come with a letter, a spell, or a very sharp knife. The morning air is cool and unnervingly quiet. Too quiet, considering where you're heading. You pass shuttered tea houses, empty market stalls, even a geisha house with its lantern still dark. The floating world feels paused, choked, like someone's taken the breath out of it. That's when you see them, officials in stiff black robes, standing at the edge of Yoshiwara's entrance with scrolls in hand. One begins to read aloud in a flat, bored tone. The others post signs on every gate and doorway. No music, no painted faces, no more red lanterns. The pleasure quarters are officially closed by order of the Tokugawa shogunate. It's not the first time this has happened. It won't be the last. But today you're seeing it up close. The attempt to choke off desire with ink and policy. The shogunate, terrified of moral decline, economic waste and public disorder, has launched a full-blown morality campaign. And it's not just Yoshiwara. Brothels, theatres, even bathhouses are being regulated, surveilled, or outright shuttered. You hear the phrase sumptuary laws whispered like a curse. These are rules designed to curb extravagance, prohibit indulgence, and force everyone, from peasant to daimyo, to live more proper lives. Translation: less fun, fewer orgasms. Historical fact: the Tokugawa shogunate periodically enforced strict moral reforms, particularly under Shogun Tokugawa Yoshimune in the 18th century. These reforms targeted what were seen as immoral luxuries, expensive clothes, lavish parties, and especially the sex trade. Yoshiwara was shut down multiple times or forced to operate under extreme restrictions. Of course, it always reopened. You trail a pair of officials into a brothel, where the madame is already sweeping out the entrance. She bows with icy politeness. "We understand," she says, and thank the shogun for his wisdom. Then as soon as the men leave, she rolls her eyes so hard you're amazed they don't fall out of her head. "They'll be back next month," she mutters, "with a letter of apology and a discount voucher. Because here's the thing about banning pleasure. People don't stop wanting. They just get creative. You're led into the back where courtesans are quickly changing outfits. Kimonos with muted colours, hairstyles less ornate. A courtesan named Rin pulls you aside and laughs. "Now we're just a tea service with music. We don't sell sex. We simply appreciate the company of our guests, intellectually." She winks. "And if someone wants to leave a large tip after appreciating us, who are we to refuse gratitude?" Quirky fact: during strict enforcement periods, brothels often rebranded as entertainment parlours and courtesans as hostesses. They created entire euphemistic vocabularies, tea appointments, reading sessions, incense meetings, to continue their work under a veil of legitimacy. Some even handed out poetry critique cards as receipts. You leave the quarter and head toward the theatre district, only to find a Kabuki troupe performing in an empty courtyard instead of their usual stage. The actors wear simpler robes, the lines are rewritten to avoid romantic entanglements, and any overt innuendo has been smothered with forced moral endings. A story that once ended in passionate suicide now concludes with the lovers getting married, joining a temple, and gardening in silence for the rest of their lives. The crowd stares blankly. One child starts crying. But underneath the play's surface something else is happening. An extra pause in a glance. A certain line read too slowly. A gesture that lingers longer than it should. The audience catches on. They laugh at the wrong parts. They know. Everyone knows. The government posts more officials in the streets, minders tasked with keeping pleasure out of sight. But the people, seasoned veterans of hypocrisy, find new ways to signal their intent. A merchant sends a lacquered comb to a courtesan, pretending it's a business gift. A geisha hosts a poetry night where every verse is about rain soaking through silk. A samurai walks his dog past a lover's house every morning at the same hour, pausing just long enough to make his presence known. There's a scholarly debate about how effective the shogunate's morality campaigns really were. Some historians say they reinforced class hierarchies and pushed sex work further underground, where women had fewer protections. Others argue that the rituals and euphemisms that emerged gave people new ways to express agency and desire, even within censorship. Either way, the pleasure never stopped. It just changed clothes. Later that evening, you return to Yoshiwara, now dark and oddly quiet. A single lantern flickers in a side alley, marking an herbal consultation shop that's clearly a front. Inside, 3 courtesans sit playing cards, drinking sake, and laughing about their new careers as tea instructors. One pulls out a fan with calligraphy that reads, "For noble appreciation only." The others burst out laughing. You ask if they're angry. One shrugs. "Not really. This happens every few years. They shut us down to feel powerful. We pretend to obey. Then they remember their wives don't want to sleep with them and come back with coins." She sets down her sack cup. Desire always finds a way. You step back out into the alley, where the sound of shamisen quietly wafts through a closed door. Forbidden music. Forbidden laughter. The forbidden world, alive and well, just dimmed slightly, but still pulsing. That's the thing about pleasure in feudal Japan. You can ban it, tax it, rebrand it, but you can't erase it. Not with scrolls, not with guards, not even with shame, not when people have bodies, have wants, have hearts that still beat harder when someone brushes their sleeve just a little too deliberately. And tonight, all across Edo, somewhere behind sliding doors, someone is ignoring the rules again. It's just before dawn when you find yourself at the edge of Nagasaki Bay, watching the sails of foreign ships bob gently against the horizon. There's a strange smell in the air, part seawater, part unfamiliar spices, part human curiosity. You've stepped into the one place in feudal Japan where the outside world was allowed in, just barely. Dejima, the artificial island where Dutch and Portuguese traders were corralled like exotic animals, welcomed but not trusted. And tonight, you're not here for silk or sugar. You're here to see what happens when foreign flesh meets local desire. When cultures collide in the bedroom and the boundaries between fascination and fetish blur like ink in rain. You cross the narrow bridge onto Dejima, watched by guards who pretend not to notice you. Inside the Dutch compound, the world looks different. European furniture, strange boots left by the door, a piano that no one has tuned in years. You follow a young interpreter through the corridors to a room filled with dim lamplight and perfume that's definitely not Japanese. A Dutch merchant is reclined lazily on a pile of silk cushions, sipping sake and laughing at something a woman has just whispered into his ear. She's local, probably a karaoke-san, a woman trained to entertain foreign guests with a mix of conversation, music and intimacy. She refills his cup with practiced ease, then climbs into his lap like she's done it 100 times, which she probably has. Historical fact: during the Edo period, Japan's policy of sakoku, closed country, restricted foreign interaction to Dejima, where only the Dutch were allowed to trade. Despite the isolationist stance, Japanese women, often from impoverished backgrounds, were permitted or coerced into forming relationships with foreign merchants. Some were formal, others transactional, and many were somewhere in between. You listen as the woman coos in broken Dutch, her accent turning even the crassest phrases into flirtation. The merchant grins and replies in equally mangled Japanese. Somehow it works. Neither fully understands the other's words, but the body language says enough. She places a hand on his chest, not for passion, but for rhythm, guiding him into the tempo she's chosen. You realise she's in control, even if he thinks he is. Outside, another woman walks past with a bottle of wine tucked under one arm. Her face is painted in a style that borrows European touches. Rouge, curled hair, a corset laced over her kimono like a strange cultural mashup. You wonder if she wears it because she wants to, or because she knows it sells. When she catches your eye, she winks. The same wink a geisha gave you days ago. Different clothes, same game. Quirky fact. Some foreign traders developed specific fetishes for Japanese women, not just for their physical appearance, but for their exotic manners and clothing. Conversely, Japanese pillow books from the era occasionally describe foreign men as clumsy, overly hairy, and humorously ill-equipped to understand subtlety. Stereotypes flew both ways, with sex as the shared language. You enter a smaller room where another couple is mid-conversation, well, sort of. The woman, older than the others, is explaining the erotic symbolism of cranes in flight. The man nods slowly, trying to follow, clearly not understanding. She stops, smiles, and kisses his cheek. "No need to think," she says in Japanese. "Just feel." He obeys, because what else is he going to do? These aren't love stories, but they're not entirely empty either. Some women formed genuine bonds with their foreign patrons. A few even became mistresses for years, bearing children later referred to as hafu, half Japanese, half European, and often raised with great secrecy. Others were discarded when the ships left, their names never written down. Their bodies remembered, but only as footnotes. There's scholarly disagreement over how consensual these arrangements really were. Some argue that these women exercise surprising agency, using cultural curiosity to secure financial support, gifts, even travel opportunities. Others point out the obvious power imbalance, noting that many women were essentially leased out by intermediaries under the guise of entertainment. Both views likely hold truth. A smile can be a strategy, so can silence. You speak with an interpreter, a sharp-eyed man who's been working this post for years. He tells you the stories no one writes, of a trader who fell deeply in love and tried to smuggle his lover aboard ship, only to be caught and banned for life. Of a woman who learned fluent Dutch just to write a letter that was never answered. Of a child raised behind closed screens, taught to bow like his mother and curse like his father. As dawn turns the water gold, you leave the compound and walk back into the Japanese quarter. The streets are waking up. Fishmongers setting up stalls, monks sweeping, temple steps. But behind one of the houses you spot two figures wrapped together in a futon, a sailor fresh off a long voyage, and a local girl whose name he probably doesn't know. They're laughing, giddy, real. And that's the thing. These encounters weren't all shadowy transactions. Some were experiments, escapes, brief flames in the long grey corridors of isolation. Not every woman was a victim, not every man was a brute, but none of them left unchanged. You walk the shoreline as the tide creeps in, imagining all the foreign desires that came and went with the ships. Some left children, some left poems, most just vanished. But for a brief moment, on a sliver of land barely wider than a city block, the world cracked open. And in the spaces between broken languages, people touched each other. Not always gently, not always kindly, but undeniably. You're walking again, though this time more slowly. The road is dusty, the air oddly thick, and everyone around you keeps their eyes low, not in shame but in wariness, like something invisible is moving through the streets. You start to notice small changes. Fewer people sharing drinking cups, more incense burning outside doorways and behind closed curtains, coughing. Not the casual kind, deep, ragged, chest-rattling coughs. You've wandered into a time of illness, and not just the seasonal kind. Tonight, you're stepping into the world of sexually transmitted infections in feudal Japan. The taboos, the myths, the medicine, and all the strange beliefs about what happens when pleasure gets too close to consequence. You stop at a small clinic run by a half-retired physician and his grandson, who seems more interested in polishing jars than treating patients. The elder doctor invites you in without surprise, and within moments he's pointing to a scroll on the wall, a diagram of the human body, hand-drawn and wildly inaccurate. The genitals are exaggerated, the internal organs shaped like fruit, and there's a dotted line from the kidneys to the feet, labelled Shame Pathway. You squint. That's where the pain begins, he says gravely, when desire turns sour. Historical fact: syphilis, beidoku or plum poison, first appeared in Japan in the early 16th century, likely brought by European traders. It spread rapidly, especially in urban pleasure districts. Though widely recognised by the Edo period, treatments remained speculative at best, ranging from herbal tonics to mercury-based salves, which often did more harm than good. A patient enters, a man in his 30s, visibly uncomfortable, trying to look casual. The doctor asks a few questions, writes something down, then hands him a packet of dried herbs with instructions to boil them 3 times and drink while facing northeast. The patient doesn't ask why. No one really does, because in this world, illness is part physical, part spiritual, especially illness of that kind. You ask the doctor what else he sees. He laughs darkly. It all starts with lust. Then it travels. Genitals, yes, but also the tongue, the blood, the eyes, sometimes the brain. He taps his temple. I saw a man who tried to eat a scroll once, said it would keep the demons from escaping through his urine. You try not to look alarmed. Outside, a local woman waits in the shade, watching the door. She doesn't enter, but you notice the faint marks on her hands, signs of mercury exposure, likely from a topical treatment. She spits into the dirt and walks away. She's probably a courtesan, maybe semi-retired, still dealing with the lingering costs of a career that demanded elegance on the surface and silence beneath it. Quirky fact: one folk remedy involved placing a slice of yanagi willow bark under the tongue during sex to prevent infection, a kind of biological lucky charm. Another popular cure included bathing in a mix of sake, salt and river mud, preferably during a new moon. Unsurprisingly, none of these worked. You make your way to a local bathhouse where gossip moves faster than soap. A woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue tells you that there's a brothel nearby where they won't accept customers who smell like gunpowder tea, a local nickname for men known to carry infection. They think they can hide it, she says, but the body always tells. She rolls up her sleeve to reveal a charm tattooed on her forearm, a small knot of kanji meant to bind misfortune. She says it keeps her safe. You don't correct her. There's ongoing scholarly debate about how widespread STI education was in Edo, Japan. Some records suggest that high-end courtesans were trained to spot early symptoms, both for their protection and their employer's reputation. Others argue that denial and superstition ruled the day, especially among lower classes. The shogunate issued occasional health advisories, but public health as a concept barely existed, and shame often killed faster than disease. You pass a pharmacy where small paper packets are sold under the name willow spirit powder. The apothecary inside insists it works, cleanses the blood, clears the mind, realigns the soul. He offers you a sample. It smells like old leather and crushed mint. You decide not to ask what's in it. That night, you find yourself near a quiet temple where women tie prayers onto a willow tree, the very symbol used in countless charms against infection. You listen to their murmured hopes for healing, for forgiveness, for forgetfulness. Some of them aren't even sick, they're just afraid. Of lovers who vanished, of clients who coughed too much, of memories they can't quite scrub clean. One woman burns a letter. You catch a glimpse before it curls into ash. A name, a date, a promise. I will return when the fever breaks. You suspect he didn't. As you walk back through the city, the signs are subtle but everywhere. Itching powder in the market stalls, bitter tea sold in, secret quiet glances exchanged between people who've made mistakes but can't say them aloud. Because even in a culture as poetic and permissive as feudal Japan, there were things too real for the floating world. The body, when it betrays, is never polite. Still, the pleasure never stops, only pauses, hides, adapts. The infections came with the desire, the cures came with the hope, and somewhere between them, people kept loving anyway. You've wandered far from the bustling cities and bright lanterns now. The moon is high, but it doesn't feel comforting. It feels like a watcher. You've crossed into the realm of stories, the kind whispered beside hearths, passed from grandmother to child, or muttered drunkenly at midnight as someone pours sake for a ghost they hope never visits. Tonight, sex is not a matter of bodies, it's a matter of spirits. Because in feudal Japan, the desires of the living were matched only by the hungers of the dead. This is the world of yokai, of vengeful lovers, haunted bedrooms, and spectral touch. Tonight, you're lying with ghosts. You find yourself outside a thatched roof farmhouse on the edge of a remote mountain village. The house has been empty for weeks, maybe longer, but the locals won't go near it. They say a man died here, his breath stolen by a ghost in the night. She came back, the old fisherman says, because he promised her too much and gave her too little. You raise an eyebrow. Promised what? He shrugs. A comb, a baby, forever. Historical fact. Japanese folklore is filled with stories of onryo, vengeful female spirits, often wronged in life by betrayal, abandonment or death during childbirth. These ghosts were believed to return not just to torment the living, but sometimes to seek physical connection, sleeping with former lovers or luring strangers into fatal embraces. You step inside the house. Dust coats the floor, but the futon is surprisingly neat. A single strand of long black hair rests on the pillow. You try to pretend that's not deeply unsettling. On the wall is a faded woodblock print, an image of a woman with hair that spills to her knees, eyes dark as ink and lips slightly parted. A whisper slides past your ear. You spin around, nothing. But the hair is no longer on the pillow. You don't sleep. Later, a travelling monk arrives in the village. He listens to the story, nods grimly, and draws a charm in salt across the threshold. Love unfulfilled becomes poison, he says, especially when she waited too long. You ask if he believes the man really died from a ghost. He shrugs. Some men die from ghosts, others from regret. Same result. You travel next to a shrine near a hot spring, where an aging priestess shows you a collection of votive offerings: combs, hairpins, lipstick cases, tiny wrapped bundles of kimono fabric. Gifts for the lovers we failed, she says, or for the ones who left before we could say goodbye. She explains that some women died before consummating love, and tradition held that their spirits would remain restless, especially if the man moved on. Their bodies don't forget, she says, even if their breath is gone. Quirky fact. One common yokai was the Yuki Onna, or Snow Woman, a ghostly figure who appears in winter to seduce travellers with beauty and warmth, only to freeze them to death with a kiss. In many versions of the story, the man knows something is off but gives in anyway. Because men. You hear tales of husbands waking to find their wives cold beside them. Cold not metaphorically, but literally. Of courtesans who died during epidemics but returned to fulfill scheduled appointments. Of travellers who shared a night of passion in an inn, only to find the room empty by morning and the bedding damp with seawater. One story even tells of a woman who married a man, lived with him for years, and only revealed her true form when he accidentally cut his finger, and she licked the blood too hungrily. There's scholarly debate, naturally, about how to interpret these stories. Some see them as cautionary tales, reinforcing societal norms by punishing transgressive women with monstrous afterlives. Others view them as expressions of suppressed female agency, spirits who, in death, found the power they lacked in life. Yet others argue they served a therapeutic function, helping communities process grief, betrayal, and fear through narrative. Whatever the origin, the result is the same. You can't separate sex from death in these stories. Desire is dangerous, and sometimes it follows you home. In Kyoto, you visit a theatre where a Kabuki play is being staged about a woman betrayed by her lover, poisoned by jealousy, and returned as a ghost to drag him to the underworld. The audience knows the story. They cheer when she rises from the floorboards, hair wild, mouth smeared with ink. You hear a teenager whisper to his friend, "She was too beautiful to stay dead." The friend nods solemnly. Later, you find a painted scroll depicting a spirit lying beside a man, her body half translucent, her expression both mournful and hungry. The man sleeps peacefully, unaware, at least for now. In the margin, someone has written, "What is love? if not a haunting. You spend the night in a roadside inn, the only guest. The innkeeper tells you to ignore the sound of footsteps at midnight. She only visits those who don't believe in her, he says. You lock your door anyway, just in case. And as you lie awake, every creak in the rafters becomes a whisper. Every gust of wind feels like a breath on your neck. You remember the stories, the gifts left behind, the kisses that tasted of ash. You don't see anyone that night. But you leave a small hairpin on your pillow anyway, just in case she came and you forgot to say hello. You're back in the city now, but it feels different. Maybe it's the hour, midday, with laundry flapping from second-story windows and merchants shouting prices over the hum of passing carts. Or maybe it's just you. You've seen a lot. Laughed in brothels, whispered with ghosts, listened to the sighs of courtesans and the judgments of monks. But as you lean against a bridge railing and look down at the slow-moving canal below, one question keeps surfacing. What became of all this? The poetry, the pleasure, the secrets passed hand to hand like folded fans. Do any of them still echo in modern Japan? You follow your feet into a bookstore tucked between a tea shop and a discount clothing stall. Inside, it's quiet but not old. The shelves are neat, filled with manga, sleek design magazines, and, if you dig deep enough, reprints of classic Shunga. They're sealed in plastic, labelled for research. You raise an eyebrow. Of course they are. A young couple browses in the corner, giggling as they flip through a risque photo book featuring models dressed as geisha, but with skirts a little too short and heels that never existed in the Edo period. It's cosplay, sure, but it's also longing, a stylized reach towards something their ancestors probably never discussed aloud. You step back outside and head toward Asakusa, where a few streets still carry the faint perfume of the floating world. In a corner shop, a modern-day geiko, Kyoto's term for geisha, adjusts her makeup in the mirror. She's got an iPhone next to her makeup kit, a pack of gum tucked inside her obi. Her client tonight is a foreign business executive. He wants the full experience, she says, and you're not sure if she means that reverently or with a smirk, probably both. Historical fact. Though the traditional world of geisha and licensed courtesans declined sharply with modernization and the abolition of government-sanctioned pleasure quarters in the late 1800s, elements survived and evolved. Today, geisha still train and perform in select districts. Escort services, host and hostess bars, and love hotels now dominate Japan's adult entertainment industry, reflecting both continuity and change in how the country engages with sex and companionship. You pass a vending machine that sells cold coffee, hot soup, and discreetly, condoms printed with cherry blossoms. There's a sleek efficiency to it. Anonymous, fast, no need for poetry. But nearby you also spot a small shrine where someone's left a love letter tucked behind a fox statue. The paper's fresh, written by hand, folded 3 times. That never really goes away. You visit a sex museum next. Modern, clean, packed with foreign tourists blushing their way past 18th century erotica. In a glass case sits a set of Edo-era sex toys carved from polished wood. Elegant, detailed, still somehow deeply weird. A tour guide explains them with a rehearsed smile. These were not just for function, but for art. You glance at the teenage couple trying not to laugh. The spirit of Shunga lives on. Quirky fact. Some modern Japanese adults, especially women, collect vintage Shunga prints not just for aesthetics, but as a way to reclaim a sexual history that feels richer and less repressed than the sanitized narratives offered in school textbooks. For some, it's art. For others, it's therapy. Later you sit in a small cafe and scroll through your phone. Articles about Japan's declining birth rate, debates over sexless marriages, surveys reporting a generation of young adults more interested in sleep and anime than dating. You wonder if the stories you've seen, the poetry and the longing, the rituals and rebellion, are fading. Or maybe they're just evolving again. There's an open debate, scholars, psychologists, sociologists all weighing in, about Japan's current relationship to sex. Is it repression, evolution, fatigue? Is it the lingering effect of centuries of compartmentalizing desire behind formality? Or is it simply the modern struggle of a society pulled between individual freedom and deeply embedded cultural scripts? You think about the courtesans who recited poetry between clients and the monks who whispered names they weren't supposed to remember. You think about the peasants sharing a futon while children slept nearby, the geisha who made you laugh without touching you, the straw doll with a name carved into its chest. None of them had easy answers, but all of them were trying to find something, to give, or take, or understand. As the sky turns from gold to grey, you visit one last place, a museum exhibit featuring the reconstructed interior of a Yoshiwara brothel room. Behind glass there's a futon, a small writing desk, a doll's comb. You lean closer. There's a note on the table, translated neatly beneath it. I will wait for you under the plum tree. If you do not come, I will still wait. No name, no date. You walk outside and realise the city's alive with echoes. They're just harder to hear now, soft, like the sound of silk brushing across a wooden floor, or the whisper of breath in a poem no one's recited in 100 years. But they're there. Maybe they always will be. So here we are, at the end of it all. Or maybe just standing at a quiet bend in a much longer path. You've walked through misty moonlit gardens, stepped into perfumed rooms, and sat across from people who lived hundreds of years ago, but somehow still feel uncannily close. You've seen what sex meant to courtesans and poets, monks and merchants, wives and wandering samurai. You've watched desire bloom through paper walls and burn letters into ash. And more than anything, you've realised this. Sex in feudal Japan wasn't a side note. It was a language, a ritual, a quiet rebellion, a secret religion humming just beneath the surface of the everyday. It's tempting to look back and romanticise it all, the silk, the incense, the whispered names in candlelight. But behind those beautiful scenes were real people, aching in real ways. People who longed for touch but couldn't speak it. People who wanted more or less or something entirely different. Some had names we remember, most didn't. But they all felt the same pulse that still runs through you now, even if you dress it in modern clothes and call it by different names. And as strange as some of their rituals were, moaning guides, vinegar-soaked charms, seaweed contraception, you can't help but notice the patterns, the same hesitations, the same grief, the same giddy flush when someone touches your wrist for just a second too long. Turns out the centuries didn't change that much. They just gave us more words, more walls, more screens. So as you turn out your light tonight and settle deeper into your pillow, remember this. Love is always a little bit haunted. Sex is always a little bit sacred. And no matter how many rules get written or rewritten, the heart will always find a way to reach across the space between two people, even if that space is filled with centuries. Sweet dreams, traveller.